It starts before you even notice it, before you're awake, before you open your eyes, before a thought becomes language in your mind. There is a filter, so subtle you could live your entire life and never see it directly, and yet it shapes nearly everything you call reality. Most people spend their entire existence trusting their senses and thoughts as honest reflections of the world. But that trust is misplaced, and the deception is quiet. The truth is, you don't see reality. You see your version of reality, edited, revised, censored, and decorated to protect your existing beliefs. This is not a flaw of character or a rare condition. It's the default setting of the human mind. The process is automatic. Your brain receives more sensory input in a single second than you could consciously process in a year. From all that noise, your mind must select what to notice, what to ignore, what to emphasize, and what to dismiss. It makes these decisions based on the beliefs you already have, your worldview, your self-image, your history, your fears, and your hopes. In psychology, this is known as confirmation bias, but it is deeper than the standard textbook explanation. It is not just about believing what you want to believe. It's about not even being able to see what contradicts you. The filter begins before facts, before logic, before awareness. You think you are gathering evidence, but in truth, you are gathering reinforcement. The invisible filter is not passive. It is a guard dog, patrolling the boundaries of your mind, keeping out what could threaten your identity or worldview. This filter does not operate out of malice. Its purpose is efficiency and survival. It is easier, safer, and faster for your mind to use shortcuts, heuristics, than to question every signal, every piece of news, every comment from a stranger. You have a finite pool of mental energy each day. To preserve it, the brain rewards you for noticing things that confirm your current beliefs and quietly ignores what doesn't fit. Over time, the world you experience is not the world that exists. It is the world that aligns with the story you're already telling yourself. You can see this in action everywhere. In politics, people seek out media and communities that echo their own views and dismiss any contradictory evidence as fake or biased. In relationships, a person who believes they are unlovable will ignore affection and focus on small slights, reinforcing their narrative of unworthiness. A scientist might disregard data that complicates a cherished theory, not because they are dishonest, but because the mind filters discomfort before it reaches conscious thought. You are never simply an observer. You are the editor, the censor, the designer of the version of the world you see. The invisible filter is so pervasive that it even shapes your memories. What you remember from your past isn't a recording. It's a reconstruction, revised each time you recall it to better fit the current story you believe about yourself and your world. If you see yourself as a victim, your memory will enhance details of past injustice and blur moments of agency. If you think you are a winner, failures become vague and successes are highlighted in bold. The filter rewrites history, quietly, efficiently, without your permission. It doesn't end with individual thought. This bias is social, viral, and contagious. Once an idea takes root in a community, the filter is amplified. Social media algorithms are not designed to show you the truth. They are designed to keep you engaged. And nothing is more engaging than content that aligns perfectly with what you already believe. The filter becomes an echo chamber, and before long, the distance between groups becomes unbridgeable. Each side believes they alone are rational and awake, and the other is blind or corrupt. Reality is no longer a common ground, but a battleground of curated illusions. The filter also affects your sense of self. It can make you overconfident, convinced that your perception is clearer than everyone else's. If you spot someone else's bias, it feels like a triumph of insight, never realizing that your own invisible filter is just as active, just as distorting, just as protective of your identity. The more convinced you are of your objectivity, the more blind you become to the mechanisms shaping your vision. Is there any escape? The first step is awareness. But even that is fragile. Knowing about the filter doesn't disable it. It only introduces a little doubt. You can try to seek out disconfirming evidence. But even that is fraught with the risk of selective interpretation. You'll find reasons to dismiss it, reinterpret it, or fold it back into your narrative. The invisible filter is clever. It adapts to your attempts to see through it. When you read about a bias, you might assume it applies to everyone except yourself. When confronted with evidence that you might be wrong, you feel discomfort, and your mind looks for any loophole to return to comfort. Psychologists have studied this filter in countless ways, from classic experiments to real-world events. The famous Stanford prison experiment, the Milgram obedience studies, and even modern research on news consumption all point to the same underlying truth. People do not simply see and judge the world. They filter, then see, then judge, and finally rationalize. Even experts are not immune. A scientist may believe they have followed strict procedures, but unconscious bias seeps into the framing of hypotheses, the collection of data, and the interpretation of ambiguous results. A judge may believe she is impartial, but her mind has already filtered the faces, words, and details that fit her worldview before she makes her ruling. The invisible filter is a defense mechanism, but also a prison. It protects you from the chaos of too much information, but it locks you inside the walls of your own assumptions. If you want to see the world as it really is, you must start by questioning how you see it all. This requires not only humility, but active discomfort, a willingness to feel the anxiety that comes with uncertainty, and to resist the mind's urge to return to the comfort of confirmation. In daily life, the filter affects the smallest decisions. You may choose a friend based on a feeling of connection, not noticing that your mind has selected for people who confirm your own ideas and attitudes. You may reject a new perspective not because it is wrong, but because it is foreign to your mental framework. Even your sense of what is obvious or common sense is itself a product of countless silent filtering operations, shaped by culture, upbringing, language, and even genetics. What feels like intuition is usually the end result of selective perception. Why does the mind hold on to this filter so tightly? Because the alternative, cognitive chaos, is exhausting. Without some way to limit and organize information, the mind would be overwhelmed, paralyzed by indecision. The filter is a shortcut, but it comes at the cost of truth. It keeps you comfortable, certain, and safe, but it also makes you vulnerable to self-deception, error, and manipulation. Those who understand the filter, marketers, propagandists, politicians, can use it against you, feeding you messages crafted to pass through your filter and reinforce their own goals. Some try to bypass the filter by using logic, science, or deliberate skepticism. These tools can help, but only if used with self-awareness. Logic itself can be filtered, used only to justify what you already want to believe. Science is a method of testing, not a guarantee of objectivity. And even the most rigorous experiments are subject to interpretation. Skepticism can easily become just another form of selective rejection, where you doubt only what threatens your current worldview. What does it take to weaken the filter? The answer is unsettling. You must want to see differently more than you want to be comfortable. You must accept that discomfort is a sign you are reaching the edge of your filter, not that something is wrong with the world. Real change is rare because most people would rather be certain than be right. The filter is not your enemy. It is a part of you, but until you recognize its presence, you will never know what you are missing. In the end, the invisible filter is not something you defeat, but something you must live with aware, vigilant, and humble. Every belief you hold, every perception you trust, every judgment you make has passed through a gate you did not build and cannot dismantle. The mind's greatest illusion is that it sees the world as it is. The deepest truth is that you see only what the filter allows. And so, the question is not, do I have a filter? But what am I not seeing right now, and why? The real world remains out there, unfiltered. But the world inside your head is yours alone, shaped and reshaped, quietly and constantly, by the invisible filter you cannot see. The mirror trap, how you project your own mind onto everyone else. It is easy to think you know what someone else is thinking. It is automatic to assume that what makes sense to you makes sense to them, that your emotions are obvious, that your intentions are clear, and that their intentions can be guessed from your own. This is the mirror trap, a deep, quiet distortion of the mind that causes you to mistake your inner world for a window into other people. You look outward, but what you really see is a reflection of yourself. Most people don't realize how much they do this. You meet someone and immediately begin filling in gaps about their motives, their feelings, their values, using your own mind as the template. The brain evolved to be social, but not to be truly objective about others. Its shortcuts were built for survival, not truth. The same neural machinery that lets you understand your own feelings gets hijacked when you try to imagine what someone else feels. Empathy, theory of mind, even basic social perception, these are filtered through your own assumptions, history, and personality. The mirror trap starts small. You notice a friend is quiet. You feel insecure, so you project that onto them, assuming they are upset with you. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they're distracted. But your mind reflexively fills in the gaps with your own story. If you are anxious, you see anxiety everywhere. If you are trusting, you see others as trustworthy. If you expect betrayal, every neutral act becomes suspicious. The trap is not conscious or malicious. It is simply the easiest path for your mind to follow. In relationships, the mirror trap creates misunderstandings that can last for years. Two people, both acting in good faith, can end up hurt or angry, not because of what happened, but because of what they each projected onto the other. One person withdraws because they need space. The other sees rejection and responds with coldness, which is then perceived as confirmation of the rejection. A cycle is born, not of real events, but of reflected fears and expectations. The relationship becomes a hall of mirrors, each person seeing only their own mind in the actions of the other. The mirror trap extends into larger groups and societies. Political polarization, for example, is driven not just by differences in values, but by each side's assumption that the other thinks and feels as they themselves would, if they held the other side's beliefs. This is why people often say, "How could anyone believe that?" The truth is that they cannot imagine the other mind. Instead, they create a distorted version of themselves and use that as a model. The result is a society where people talk past each other, unable to recognize genuine difference, only assumed malice or stupidity. Projection also infects morality. When you judge others, you use your own moral standards as a measuring stick, rarely stopping to ask whether they share those standards or understand the world in the same way. This leads to moral outrage, self-righteousness, and a constant sense of disappointment in others. You expect people to react as you would, to prioritize what you prioritize, to feel guilt or shame for the same things that move you. When they don't, you judge harshly, not because they are truly bad, but because they are not your reflection. At the deepest level, the mirror trap shapes identity itself. If you grow up feeling unloved, you may come to believe that love itself is conditional, that everyone secretly withholds affection, that every kindness is temporary or transactional. Without realizing it, you project your pain outward, interpreting ambiguous acts as evidence that the world is as cold as your own wounds. If you are taught that vulnerability is weakness, you will see weakness in those who open up, even if they are stronger than you in ways you cannot admit. The trap does not care about reality. It cares about coherence, about making your inner world feel like the only possible world. Psychologists have demonstrated the mirror trap in countless experiments. In classic studies on false consensus, people consistently overestimate how many others share their beliefs, preferences, or behaviors. In negotiation research, people assume that their own logic is universal, leading to deadlocks and resentment. Even in simple games, players project their own strategies onto opponents, missing opportunities to see genuine difference or unpredictability. The pattern is the same. Instead of seeing others, you see your own mind dressed up in their circumstances. Social media amplifies the mirror trap. When you encounter someone online, you see only a thin sliver of their real self, words on a screen, a picture, a fragment of opinion. Your brain fills in the rest, constructing a personality based on your own experiences, biases, and mood at the time. This is why online conflicts escalate so quickly and feel so personal. You are not fighting with a stranger. You are fighting with your own mental projection, unable to grasp that the real person is unknowable, distant, and shaped by an entirely different world. The mirror trap is dangerous because it feels so natural. It spares you the discomfort of not knowing, of uncertainty, of admitting that other minds are mysterious and opaque. It lets you move through the world with confidence, trusting your intuition, your first impressions, your sense of what kind of person someone is. But this confidence is hollow. It is built on the assumption that your own mind is the template for all minds, and that assumption is almost always wrong. How do you escape the mirror trap? The first step is humility, a recognition that you do not know as much as you think you do about anyone, not even those closest to you. It requires accepting that your interpretations are guesses, shaped by your own mind more than by any real insight into the other. When you feel certain about someone's motives, pause and ask, what part of me is being reflected back? Is my anger, fear, or hope coloring my interpretation? Am I projecting a story that feels familiar, rather than trying to see what is actually there? Practicing curiosity can help. Instead of assuming, ask. Instead of projecting, listen. Let the discomfort of not knowing remind you that you are in the presence of another consciousness, with its own history, wounds, and logic. True empathy is not feeling for others as you feel for yourself, but letting them remain strange, complex, and unpredictable. It means abandoning the fantasy of the perfect mirror and accepting the real work of connection, asking, listening, and suspending judgment. The mirror trap cannot be dismantled entirely. It is part of being human, but you can learn to notice its presence, to slow down your assumptions, to question your certainty. When you realize how often you are seeing yourself in others, you can begin to wonder what you are missing, what realities are out there, beyond the walls of your own mind. In the end, the greatest act of respect you can offer another person is to admit you do not know them fully. The greatest act of self-awareness is to recognize that your interpretations, your judgments, even your affections and resentments, are filtered through your own history and fears. Every time you think, I know what they mean, or I know how they feel, remember that you may be standing in front of a mirror, mistaking your own reflection for the truth. There is freedom in this realization, but it is not comfortable. It asks you to surrender your illusions of mastery and settle into a world of genuine difference. It asks you to do the hardest thing of all, to listen not just with your ears, but with the humility of not knowing, to look for the parts of others that do not fit your story, to notice when you are angry at someone for something that lives only in your own mind, and to wonder, always, what is real, and what is only your own face looking back at you. You walk through life surrounded by reflections, some clear, some distorted, some so convincing that you forget they are not real. The mirror trap is everywhere, in your family, your friendships, your politics, your deepest beliefs. The only way to see past it is to look for the cracks in the glass, the hints that the world is not as you assume. When you do, you may discover something rare, the possibility of truly meeting another person, not as a reflection, but as a reality. And in that moment, the trap weakens. You step outside yourself, if only for a moment, and for the first time, you see the comfort of familiar pain, why the mind prefers known suffering over unknown freedom. There is a paradox at the center of human behavior that is so quiet, so consistent, and so universal that most people never stop to question it. The paradox is this: given the chance to escape a painful situation, many people remain where they are. The suffering is real. The alternatives are open, yet the choice is to stay. This is not laziness or weakness, but a reflection of something deeper in the structure of the mind. Familiar pain, for all its misery, offers a kind of certainty, and for the human brain, certainty is often more valuable than happiness, more seductive than freedom, and more enduring than hope. The story is older than memory. Someone lives in a job that drains them, in a relationship that wounds them, or in a pattern of behavior that leaves them empty. From the outside, it seems obvious: leave, change, try something new. The path to freedom is visible, but it goes unexplored. What holds them back is not just fear of the unknown, but comfort in the known, even when the known is suffering. The mind clings to what is familiar, not because it is good, but because it can be predicted. The pain is measured, mapped, contained. The future, no matter how promising, is uncertain, and uncertainty is experienced by the brain not as possibility, but as threat. At the root of this paradox lies the brain's deep need for control. Pain that you know can be managed. It can be prepared for, explained, ritualized. The mind knows how to interpret each signal, how to anticipate the next blow, how to build stories around what hurts. This familiarity allows for a sense of order, even dignity, in the face of suffering. The unknown, freedom, change, risk, offers no such assurances. It opens the door to chaos, to the possibility that things could be worse, that you could be lost, that your sense of identity could dissolve. For many, the horror of uncertainty is greater than the agony of pain already endured. This preference is not simply emotional. It is biological. The stress response in the human body is not only triggered by physical pain or trauma, but also by unpredictability. Studies in neuroscience show that the brain's fear circuitry lights up more in the face of ambiguous threats than predictable ones. In experiments, people will often choose a guaranteed mild shock over the chance of a stronger, but uncertain, one. The anticipation of not knowing, of not having a script, of not having a defense, provokes more anxiety than the suffering itself. Familiar pain, then, is not just tolerated. It is, at some level, preferred. Cultural patterns reinforce this bias. Children learn early that stability and routine are virtues, that better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Family traditions, social expectations, and even religious beliefs teach people to endure, to persist, to accept what is given rather than risk what is not guaranteed. The stories you tell yourself about who you are, your worth, your limits, your place in the world, are built from the materials of what you already know. Even when these stories are marked by pain, they offer continuity. To change them is to risk stepping into a narrative with no ending, no guide, and no clear identity. The psychology of trauma deepens this paradox. Survivors of abuse, neglect, or chronic adversity often find themselves returning, consciously or not, to situations that echo their earliest wounds. This repetition is not masochism, but the mind's effort to find safety in the predictable. It is easier, at some level, to be hurt in familiar ways than to open oneself to the vulnerability of genuine change. The mind builds defenses around the old pain, rationalizations, justifications, even nostalgia. Freedom from pain is theoretically possible, but it demands facing the terror of not knowing who you would be without it. You see this pattern everywhere. In the person who stays in a loveless relationship, convinced it is better than being alone. In the employee who endures a toxic workplace because the idea of searching for a new job is overwhelming. In the addict who returns to the substance, not for pleasure, but for the certainty of what will follow. Even in the minor routines of daily life, the habits that waste time, the anxieties that drain energy, familiar discomfort feels safer than unfamiliar relief. The mind attaches itself to what it knows, because what it knows is part of who it believes itself to be. The comfort of familiar pain also shapes collective behavior. Entire communities, even nations, can become trapped in cycles of dysfunction because the alternative is unthinkable. Leaders maintain the status quo, not out of malice, but because the structures of the past, however flawed, are understandable. Attempts at reform are met with suspicion, not because people love suffering, but because the unknown threatens the fragile order that keeps life bearable. Change becomes the enemy, not because of its content, but because of its unpredictability. There is a subtle dignity in endurance, but it can easily become a prison. The mind's attachment to known pain is not just a personal failing. It is a survival strategy that outlives its usefulness. The stories you tell yourself, this is just how life is. I can handle it. Things could be worse, become barriers to growth. Over time, the pain that was once a challenge becomes an identity. The idea of freedom starts to feel alien, even dangerous. The possibility of happiness is reframed as a risk not worth taking. Is it possible to choose freedom over familiar suffering? The answer is complicated. Awareness is the first step, but it is rarely enough. To step into the unknown, the mind must tolerate anxiety, confusion, and even grief for the loss of what was familiar, however painful. It must risk disorientation, the temporary loss of a stable story. This is why real change, whether in individuals or societies, so often comes only when the pain of staying the same finally outweighs the fear of change. Until then, the known suffering holds on. Therapists, philosophers, and teachers have all tried to guide people out of this trap, but the work is slow and often painful. It is not enough to promise a better future. The mind demands a bridge, a way to carry some piece of the familiar into the unknown, to make freedom feel less like a threat and more like an extension of what is already known. This is why gradual change, rather than abrupt transformation, is usually more successful. The mind needs time to rebuild its sense of self, to find comfort in new routines, to redefine safety. Sometimes, the first step is simply to ask a different question, not what am I suffering from, but what am I afraid to let go of? This reframing can reveal the hidden bargains you have made with your own pain, the ways in which suffering has become a shield against uncertainty. It can expose the paradox that what hurts you is also what protects you from loneliness, from unpredictability, from the terror of a blank slate. In the end, the comfort of familiar pain is not a sign of weakness or cowardice, but a testament to the mind's need for order. It is a survival mechanism that, when left unexamined, can become a lifelong constraint. If you wish to move beyond it, you must be willing to embrace uncertainty, not as chaos, but as possibility. You must be willing to risk the loss of your old story in exchange for the chance to write a new one. This is not a simple or linear process. The pull of the familiar is strong, and the mind resists change at every turn. There will be moments of regret, of nostalgia for the pain you left behind, of temptation to return to the certainty of old wounds. But if you persist, if you let yourself step into the unknown, with all its anxiety and promise, you may discover that freedom is not the absence of pain, but the ability to choose something new. The mind will always seek comfort, but comfort does not always serve you. Sometimes, the greater act of courage is not to endure, but to release, to let go of the pain you know in order to discover the freedom you cannot yet imagine. In this way, the deepest act of healing is not escape from suffering, but surrender to uncertainty. Only then can the mind begin to find comfort, not in what is familiar, but in what is possible. Confirmation bias, how truth gets drowned by agreement. It is possible to spend your whole life thinking you are searching for the truth, when in reality, you are only searching for agreement. This is the quiet power of confirmation bias, a bias so subtle, so fundamental to the architecture of thought, that it often escapes notice even as it shapes every decision, belief, and interpretation. The mind wants to see itself as a neutral judge, carefully weighing evidence and considering all sides. In practice, it is more like a lawyer for its own beliefs, finding, favoring, and defending evidence that supports what it already thinks is true, while dismissing or downplaying anything that contradicts it. This is not an occasional flaw, but a deep-seated feature of human cognition. Confirmation bias begins long before any conscious decision is made. The moment you form an opinion, no matter how weak or provisional, your mind starts to filter the world to protect that opinion. Evidence that supports your view is noticed, remembered, and shared. Evidence that challenges it is ignored, rationalized, or even forgotten. Over time, the process is self-reinforcing. You become more convinced that you are right, not because you have weighed all the evidence, but because you have selectively gathered only what fits. This mechanism is ancient. In the earliest days of human evolution, survival depended on quick decisions. Hesitation could be fatal, and so the mind evolved to favor coherence over contradiction. If your group believed something was dangerous, it was safer to agree than to challenge. Agreement meant acceptance, and acceptance meant survival. The same tendency now operates in modern life, but instead of protecting you from predators, it shields you from the discomfort of being wrong. The world is full of information, far more than any person can process. Confirmation bias is, in part, a way to simplify this complexity. It provides a shortcut, a method of making sense of overwhelming data. But what is gained in simplicity is lost in accuracy. The more you look for agreement, the less you see what is actually there. Your mind becomes an echo chamber, amplifying your beliefs, muting dissent, until eventually, disagreement feels not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. You can see confirmation bias everywhere, in every sphere of life. In politics, people gravitate toward news sources that echo their existing views. When those sources present stories that confirm what the audience already believes, the stories are accepted uncritically. Contradictory reports are dismissed as unreliable or biased, regardless of their quality. The result is polarization. Two groups, each certain that they are informed and rational, each convinced that the other is blind or misled. The truth drowns in a sea of agreement. The same bias operates in science, though the methods are more sophisticated. Researchers, like everyone else, are vulnerable to the temptation to see what they expect. Experiments are designed, data is interpreted, and anomalies are explained away in service of the favored hypothesis. Peer review is meant to guard against this, but even then, the pressure to confirm the prevailing view is strong. Entire fields can go years reinforcing false assumptions, not out of malice or incompetence, but because the machinery of agreement is so efficient. In personal life, confirmation bias shapes relationships, careers, even your sense of self. If you believe you are unworthy, you notice slights and ignore kindness. If you see yourself as competent, you remember successes and overlook mistakes. Arguments become battles for agreement, not mutual understanding. The goal shifts from discovering what is true to securing validation from others and yourself. Over time, your self-image is less a reflection of reality and more a product of all the agreements, real or imagined, you have accumulated. Social media has supercharged this bias. Algorithms, designed to maximize engagement, feed you content that matches your past preferences. The more you click, the narrower your view becomes. You are surrounded by voices that reinforce your own. and dissenting opinions are filtered out. The illusion is one of consensus, of being surrounded by people who see the world as you do. In reality, it is a form of intellectual isolation, where truth is secondary to the comfort of agreement. This is not just a problem for individuals. It is a challenge for society. When groups cluster around shared beliefs and filter out dissent, collective decision-making becomes distorted. Warnings go unheeded. Mistakes are repeated. Progress stalls. The feedback loops of agreement become self-sustaining, and the ability to adapt or reconsider is lost. In the extreme, entire communities, organizations, or nations can pursue disastrous paths, buoyed by nothing more than the momentum of mutual confirmation. Psychologically, confirmation bias is soothing. Agreement feels good. It offers certainty, reduces anxiety, and provides a sense of belonging. Disagreement, by contrast, feels threatening. It creates cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding contradictory ideas. Rather than endure this discomfort, the mind searches for ways to restore coherence, often by discarding the discordant information. The act is rarely conscious. Instead, you may simply feel that a certain fact doesn't seem right, or that a counterargument is missing something important. You dismiss it without fully engaging, unaware that your reasoning has already been filtered. This bias also influences memory. Studies show that people remember information that supports their beliefs more vividly and accurately than information that contradicts them. Even memories themselves are reshaped over time to become more consistent with your current beliefs. The past, like the present, is not immune to the machinery of agreement. Is it possible to escape confirmation bias? Complete escape is unlikely. The tendency is built into the way the brain organizes information, but you can mitigate its effects with deliberate effort. The first step is humility, the recognition that your confidence in your beliefs is not a guarantee of their truth. Seek out disagreement, not as an attack, but as a resource. Engage with evidence and perspectives that challenge you. Ask yourself, what evidence would make me change my mind? Am I listening to learn, or only to find agreement? In group settings, diversity of thought can be a safeguard against the drowning of truth by agreement. Encouraging dissent, rewarding curiosity, and creating space for disagreement makes it harder for confirmation bias to dominate. In science, replication and peer review slow down the rush to consensus. In everyday life, asking friends to point out your blind spots and being willing to acknowledge them helps restore balance. Perhaps the most powerful antidote is curiosity, a genuine desire to know, even if the truth is uncomfortable. Curiosity is the willingness to ask questions that do not have easy answers, to examine evidence that does not fit, to live with uncertainty. It is not easy. It requires resilience, openness, and a kind of intellectual bravery. But it is the only way to prevent agreement from drowning out reality. In the end, the mind's quest for agreement is understandable. It offers comfort, belonging, and order in a world that is often chaotic and uncertain. But comfort is not the same as truth. If you want to see clearly, you must be willing to let go of some certainty, to risk standing alone, to seek truth even when it disagrees with you. Agreement is pleasant, but reality is often uncomfortable. The choice, each day, is whether to look for what confirms or for what is. The mind will always lean toward agreement, but you can learn to recognize the pull. When everyone around you agrees, ask what might be missing. When you feel sure, wonder what you might have overlooked. When truth and agreement come into conflict, remember that the value of the former is far greater, even when it costs you the latter. Agreement is easy. Truth is rare. Confirmation bias will always whisper in your ear, inviting you to believe what you already believe, to see what you already see, to hear only the voices that tell you are right. To resist that whisper, even for a moment, is to take a step toward clarity, a step few are willing to take, but one that separates those who seek comfort from those who seek understanding. The world does not get simpler, and the mind does not get quieter, but the truth, when found, is worth the struggle against the drowning noise of agreement. Anchoring effect. The first idea you hear becomes the frame of all others. It happens so quietly you rarely notice it, and yet it can shape your choices, beliefs, and perceptions for years without your awareness. The anchoring effect is one of the mind's most persistent and underestimated distortions, a tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information you receive, using it as a reference point for everything that comes after. This anchor can be a number, an opinion, a rumor, or even a casual remark. Once it is in place, it frames your thinking, quietly warping your judgments and decisions in ways that feel rational, even as they pull you away from objectivity. Imagine walking into a shop and seeing a sweater marked at 6,000 Indian rupees. Next to it, another sweater costs 2,500 Indian rupees. The first number, whether you realize it or not, becomes an anchor. Suddenly, 2,500 Indian rupees seems reasonable, even cheap, compared to the original price. But if you had first seen a sweater for 1,000 Indian rupees, the same 2,500 Indian rupees would seem expensive. The anchor is arbitrary. It has no objective value, but your mind uses it as a baseline, a mental frame for all subsequent decisions. This same process happens far beyond shopping. It happens every time you are exposed to an initial value, opinion, or idea. The anchoring effect is not limited to trivial choices. It affects how you judge people, negotiate salaries, estimate risks, and interpret news. It starts with the brain's need for efficiency. Faced with uncertainty or ambiguity, your mind seizes the first available clue and uses it to create a sense of order. Even when you know the anchor is random or irrelevant, you still find it hard to shake its influence. Studies show that people can be anchored by numbers that are clearly absurd, such as spinning a wheel that lands on a random number. Yet their later estimates are still pulled toward that arbitrary anchor. In negotiations, the power of the anchor is obvious. The first offer made, no matter how extreme, sets the tone for the entire conversation. Counteroffers and final agreements cluster around that initial number, not because it is fair, but because it came first. Even experienced negotiators, aware of the bias, struggle to overcome its pull. The same process plays out in everyday life. The first impression you form of a person frames how you interpret their actions. The first story you hear about an event shapes how you judge later reports, regardless of their accuracy. The anchoring effect has a particularly strong hold in situations of uncertainty. When you are unsure, you are most vulnerable to the first piece of information presented. For example, when estimating the population of a city you have never visited, a random number, even one you know is random, will pull your guess in its direction. The mind's need for a starting point is so strong that almost anything will do, so long as it comes first. Once established, the anchor becomes a lens through which all other information is filtered. This bias is not only a quirk of individual psychology, it is a powerful tool for influence and manipulation. Marketers, politicians, and negotiators understand that the first number, image, or idea they present will shape the audience's perceptions and decisions. In courtrooms, the prosecution's suggested sentence can anchor the jury's sense of what is reasonable, regardless of the facts. In the news, the first report on an event often shapes public opinion, even if later corrections are made. Once the anchor is set, changing minds becomes much harder. The anchoring effect also affects your memories and self-perception. The first story you learn about yourself, from parents, teachers, or peers, sets an anchor for how you interpret your strengths and weaknesses. If you are labeled the shy one or the smart one early on, You are likely to notice evidence that supports this label and overlook what contradicts it. The anchor becomes part of your identity, a reference point you return to, even as you change and grow. Anchoring is persistent because it is adaptive. The mind evolved to make fast decisions with limited information. In a world where there is too much to consider, a starting point, any starting point, is better than none. The trouble arises when the anchor is arbitrary, misleading, or deliberately chosen to serve someone else's interests. When this happens, your thinking is quietly steered, and the feeling of confidence you have in your judgment is an illusion. Anchoring does not work alone. It combines with other biases, such as confirmation bias and the halo effect, to create a tightly woven net around your perception. Once you accept an anchor, you seek out evidence that confirms it. If the anchor is positive, you highlight good qualities. If negative, you dwell on flaws. Over time, the frame becomes a filter, and the original anchor, however irrelevant, shapes every new judgment. You can observe the anchoring effect in your daily routines. The price you expect to pay for groceries, the salary you think is fair, the standard you use to judge a friend's loyalty, all are influenced by the first number, example, or story you encountered. Even your emotional responses are anchored by your earliest experiences. The first heartbreak, the first success, the first failure, these become benchmarks, influencing how you feel about every similar event in the future. Is there a way to escape the anchoring effect? Complete escape is unlikely, but awareness can reduce its power. When you notice yourself clinging to the first piece of information, pause and ask, why am I giving this so much weight? Is it actually relevant? Or just first? Deliberately seek out alternative anchors. Compare with a wider range of data, and question whether your initial impression is justified. In group decisions, encourage others to voice different starting points before settling on a consensus. In situations where you know an anchor is likely to be set, negotiations, first impressions, major life choices, prepare yourself in advance. Bring your own data, consider a range of possibilities, and resist the urge to accept the first number or idea as the default. Practice mental flexibility. The more comfortable you become with ambiguity and a diversity of options, the less power any single anchor will have over you. Anchoring is not always harmful. Sometimes, a reliable anchor can save time and reduce stress. The danger lies in the uncritical acceptance of the first idea, in the unconscious drift that follows from that single point of reference. When you recognize this pattern, you have a chance to reset the anchor, to make a deliberate choice about where you begin, and to weigh subsequent information more fairly. It is also important to remember that others are subject to the anchoring effect as much as you are. When leading, teaching, or persuading, be aware of the anchors you set for others, the words you choose, the examples you highlight, the numbers you introduce. They will shape how others think, often more than any argument you make afterward. Ethical use of anchors means being honest about their arbitrariness, encouraging critical thinking, and inviting multiple perspectives. At its core, the anchoring effect is a reflection of the mind's vulnerability to sequence. The order in which you encounter ideas, people, and experiences can determine how you evaluate everything that follows. This is why first impressions matter, why priming works in marketing, and why early education shapes lifelong attitudes. The mind's need for a starting point is a strength in a world of chaos, but a liability in a world of persuasion. Recognizing this bias is not a cure, but it is a beginning. Each time you notice yourself drifting toward a conclusion based on what you heard first, pause. Look for other anchors. Ask yourself if the frame you are using is the only one, or simply the first one. Only then can you hope to see the world as it is, rather than as it was first presented to you. In the end, the anchoring effect is a quiet force. It does not shout or demand your attention. It whispers, gently guiding your judgments from the very first word. To resist its pull, you must become aware of the weight of beginnings, the inertia of first impressions, and the quiet authority of the anchor in your mind. The illusion of control, why you think you're steering when you're not. There is a quiet comfort in believing that you are the author of your own life. The feeling that your choices matter, that your actions shape outcomes, and that your intentions steer your future is central to the sense of self. Yet, beneath the surface of daily experience, there is a persistent illusion, one so deeply embedded that it is rarely questioned. This is the illusion of control, the mind's tendency to overestimate its influence over outcomes, to believe it is steering the ship, even when the currents are stronger than the rudder. The illusion begins early. Children, encouraged for every small accomplishment, learn that effort leads to reward. They are told they can be anything, do anything, if only they try hard enough. The message is clear, you are in control. Yet, as life unfolds, the complexity of the world exposes the limits of agency. Accidents happen, randomness intrudes, and other people's choices intervene. Still, the mind resists the truth of unpredictability. It clings to the story that effort equals outcome, that life is a game of skill rather than one of skill, chance, and circumstance woven together. Experiments in psychology reveal just how easily this illusion takes hold. In classic studies, participants are asked to roll dice or press buttons in games where the outcome is entirely random. Despite knowing the randomness, people behave as if their actions matter. They throw dice harder for high numbers, softer for low. They develop rituals, habits, and superstitions that give them a feeling of influence. Even in situations with absolutely no control, the mere act of doing something, of participating, creates a sense of agency. The same illusion is magnified in daily life. People take credit for successes, attributing them to their abilities, while blaming failures on external circumstances. This self-serving pattern is not just a defense against disappointment. It is an attempt to preserve the comforting sense that the world is predictable and responsive to your will. The alternative, that outcomes are often arbitrary, chaotic, or driven by forces beyond your awareness, is deeply unsettling. This illusion is not simply a personal quirk. It is a feature of human psychology. The mind seeks patterns, even in noise. When two events coincide, you infer causation, weaving a story in which your choices matter more than they do. When you take an umbrella and it doesn't rain, you feel responsible for warding off bad weather. When you worry about a loved one and they arrive safely, your concern feels like protection. Each small connection, each pattern, reinforces the illusion that your thoughts and actions bend the arc of events. The illusion of control is especially strong in situations of partial influence. Consider a manager leading a team, a doctor treating a patient, or an investor choosing stocks. In each case, skill and judgment play a role, but so do timing, luck, and the actions of others. Success and failure are overdetermined. There are too many variables to track. Still, the mind zooms in on the part you played, inflating its importance, minimizing everything else. This selective focus creates the belief that you are steering, even when your hand is only one on the wheel. The illusion persists because it is adaptive. Believing you have control increases motivation, persistence, and resilience. It encourages you to act, to try, to keep going in the face of setbacks. People with a strong sense of agency are more likely to take risks, seize opportunities, and recover from defeat. The belief in control, even when exaggerated, is a powerful source of hope. It fuels effort and determination. The cost, however, is confusion and frustration when the world refuses to cooperate, when outcomes are out of proportion to your input, when fate overrides intention. You can see the illusion of control in decision-making. People overestimate their influence in elections, business ventures, and even games of chance. Gamblers keep betting, convinced they can read the roulette wheel or influence the cards. In sports, fans wear lucky shirts. Players repeat rituals. Coaches pace the sidelines as if their movements affect the score. The mind desperately wants to believe that something, anything, is within its grasp. In relationships, the illusion shows up as the belief that you can change or fix others through love, advice, or effort. When things go well, you feel responsible. When they do not, you blame yourself, believing that different words or actions could have changed the outcome. This overestimation of influence is both comforting and punishing. It gives you hope, but also burdens you with guilt and regret when reality refuses to bend. In society, the illusion of control fuels both optimism and frustration. People believe they can manifest outcomes through positive thinking, that hard work guarantees success, that good intentions are enough to shape the future. When these expectations collide with reality, the result is not just disappointment, but a sense of betrayal, a feeling that the world is unfair or that you are uniquely unlucky. The truth, less comforting, is that life is a mixture of effort, chance, and external conditions, with no guarantee of reward. The illusion of control is also dangerous. It leads people to take excessive risks, to ignore warning signs, to persist in losing strategies long after they have ceased to make sense. It creates false confidence, blinds you to the influence of randomness, and makes you vulnerable to manipulation by those who promise certainty. Marketers, politicians, and self-help gurus sell the idea that you can control outcomes if you only follow their plan. The mind, eager for reassurance, buys in. Awareness of the illusion does not make it disappear. Even when you know that outcomes are uncertain, you find yourself acting as if your choices matter more than they do. You still feel responsible for things beyond your control. You still experience relief when rituals are performed, or anxiety when routines are broken. The illusion is not a belief to be dispelled, but a tendency to be managed. What, then, can you do? First, recognize the difference between influence and control. You can shape your actions, your responses, your choices, but the outcome is never fully yours. Accepting this is not resignation, but realism. It frees you from unnecessary guilt when things go wrong and from hubris when they go right. It allows you to act with intention, while letting go of the fantasy that the world will conform to your plans. Second, be wary of patterns and connections that feel meaningful. The mind is wired to find causation everywhere, but most events are overdetermined, and many are simply random. When you succeed, give credit to your effort, but also acknowledge timing, help from others, and luck. When you fail, do the same. This humility restores balance, keeping you grounded in what you can control and at peace with what you cannot. Third, resist those who offer certainty. Anyone who promises guaranteed outcomes through products, plans, or positive thinking is selling an illusion. Real growth comes from engaging with uncertainty, learning from experience, and adapting to change. Certainty is comfortable, but false. Finally, practice letting go. When anxiety rises, when you feel the urge to micromanage or obsess over details, pause. Ask yourself what is truly within your control and what is not. Focus your energy on what you can shape, your attitude, your actions, your learning. Release the rest. This act is not passivity, but wisdom. The illusion of control is a shelter from chaos. It gives you the courage to act, the resilience to endure, and the comfort of believing your choices matter. But it also hides the truth that life is uncertain. Outcomes are unpredictable, and your hand is not always on the wheel. To live well is to accept both the power you have and the limits you face, to steer when you can, and to let the currents take you when you cannot. In the end, you are neither powerless nor all-powerful. The mind craves the feeling of control, But reality is a mix of agency and accident, intention and unpredictability. The art of living is not in pretending you are steering when you are not, but in learning when to guide and when to accept, when to try and when to let go. In this balance, the illusion weakens, and what remains is a deeper, quieter form of control, not over the world, but over your response to it. Availability heuristic. How vivid memories pretend to be reality. There is a subtle trick that your mind plays, a shortcut so powerful that it shapes your sense of danger, probability, and truth without your permission. This is the availability heuristic. It is the tendency to judge the likelihood of events, or the frequency of certain experiences, by how easily examples come to mind. What is vivid, recent, or emotionally charged feels more true, more common, and more real, even when it is only a single memory among millions. In this way, your most striking memories quietly pretend to be reality, and your mind, eager for simplicity, lets them. Imagine hearing about a plane crash on the news. The story is dramatic, fire, chaos, loss. For days, the images replay in your mind, charred metal, grieving families, breaking headlines. If someone asks you a week later whether flying is dangerous, the memory is right there, vivid and sharp. You say yes, not because you have calculated the odds, but because the example is so easy to recall. In reality, air travel remains one of the safest forms of transportation, but your mind is not keeping a tally. It is searching its files for what comes up fastest. The availability heuristic is not limited to news stories. It happens every time you rely on a vivid memory, rather than actual statistics, to judge what is likely, safe, or important. If a friend was recently robbed, the city feels less safe. If you watched a movie about an inspiring teacher, the profession seems noble and rewarding. When tragedy strikes close to home, every noise in the night becomes a threat. The easier it is to remember, the more weight it carries. What fades into the background, what is routine, mundane, or lacking in drama, rarely enters your judgment, no matter how common or significant it actually is. This mental shortcut is not a flaw, but a survival strategy. In the ancient world, when danger was immediate and information was scarce, it made sense to prioritize what was memorable. If a fellow hunter was mauled by a tiger, remembering that incident, no matter how rare, could save your life. The mind evolved to treat vivid, recent, or emotionally charged information as more important than dry, abstract facts. The same logic applies today, but the environment has changed. Now, the most vivid memories are often manufactured by media, rumors, and the randomness of life, not by the true frequency of events. The danger of the availability heuristic is subtle but pervasive. It makes you overestimate rare but dramatic risks, plane crashes, terrorist attacks, shark bites, and underestimate common, less memorable dangers like heart disease or car accidents. It shapes how you vote, where you travel, what you fear, and what you trust. Politicians and advertisers exploit this bias, using shocking images and stories to guide your attention and shape your choices. The mind is built to follow what stands out, not what is most common or most likely. This heuristic also influences how you judge yourself and others. If you remember a recent failure, you may feel like you are always failing. If someone close to you has a particular habit, you may believe it is widespread, even universal. The most emotional, unusual, or memorable interactions become your reference points, and your judgment about people, groups, and even entire cultures follows from these few vivid moments. The reality, the broader, more nuanced truth, is lost in the shadow of what is easiest to recall. Memory itself is not a neutral record. It is shaped by attention, emotion, repetition, and the passage of time. The stories you tell, the news you consume, the fears you entertain, all strengthen the availability of certain memories over others. What you dwell on becomes more accessible, and what you ignore fades away. Over years, your mind becomes a collection of the most vivid moments, not the most representative ones. When asked what is likely, what is true, or what is real, you reach into this collection and mistake it for the world outside your head. This bias is not just personal, it is social. When a dramatic event happens in a community, everyone's judgment is skewed by the shared memory. A crime spree, a natural disaster, a scandal, these become anchors for group fear. Policy decisions, even prejudice. The result is collective overreaction, or sometimes collective denial, depending on which memories are most accessible. In this way, entire societies are shaped not by the true pattern of events, but by the emotional salience of what stands out. The availability heuristic can also distort hope and optimism. If you recall inspiring stories of success, you may overestimate your chances. If you have heard of rare recoveries from illness, you may believe they are common. If you have seen a few stories of rags to riches, you may downplay the real obstacles. Memory gives you confidence that does not match reality. Confidence built on what is easily remembered, not what is actually probable. The problem deepens when you realize how easy it is to manipulate the mind's availability. News cycles are engineered to make some stories unforgettable and others invisible. Social media amplifies the dramatic and emotional, burying the ordinary and unexciting. Even the language you use, how you talk about your own life, the stories you repeat, changes what comes to mind first. In a world where attention is currency, the most available memory is rarely the most true. How can you guard against the availability heuristic? The first step is to notice when you are relying on memory rather than evidence. When judging risk, frequency, or truth, pause and ask, is this just the easiest example to remember? Or is it actually common? Seek out data, not just stories. Remind yourself that what stands out is often the exception, not the rule. Deliberately broaden your sources of information. When making decisions, look for boring, routine facts, not just dramatic anecdotes. Challenge your mind to remember what does not stand out. In group discussions, notice when everyone is echoing the same recent story. Ask what else is happening that has not been talked about. When it comes to your own life, question whether your sense of success, failure, love, or danger is built on a handful of memorable moments or on a true pattern. The mind tends to organize itself around the highs and lows, the traumas and triumphs, but most of life is found in the middle, in the days that do not stand out. The availability heuristic cannot be eliminated, but it can be softened. The practice of skepticism, toward your own memory as well as others, is a start. The willingness to gather more data, to question what feels certain, and to delay judgment until more evidence is in view can help. Over time, you can learn to distrust what comes to mind first, knowing that vividness is not the same as truth. There is a humility that comes from this awareness. You realize that your mind is not a perfect guide, that what feels real is often just what is easy to remember. The world is broader, more complex, and less dramatic than your most vivid memories would suggest. Most danger is not sensational, most kindness is not headline-worthy, and most truths are not immediately accessible. In the end, the availability heuristic is a reminder of the mind's vulnerability to its own shortcuts. What stands out is not always what matters most. What you remember most easily is not always what is true. To live wisely is to learn the difference, to seek reality beyond the vivid, to look for the pattern in the ordinary, and to question what your memory insists is fact. The stories that come to mind first are rarely the whole story. Only by looking beyond them can you hope to see the world as it really is. The endowment effect. Why your mind overvalues what you already own. There is a subtle shift that happens the moment something becomes yours. It does not matter if the object is new, old, valuable, or trivial. Once you possess it, The mind attaches a sense of value that did not exist before. You become reluctant to part with it, and if asked to trade or sell, you set the price higher than you would have paid as a buyer. This is the endowment effect, a quiet, pervasive distortion that causes you to overvalue what you already own simply because it is yours. The effect is so common that it feels natural. People keep clothes they never wear, books they will never read, souvenirs gathering dust, or even food in the fridge they no longer want. When pressed, they justify the attachment. It's sentimental. It might be useful. It would be a waste to throw away. But underneath these stories is a simple bias. Once something is in your possession, your mind reclassifies it as part of your identity. To let go is not just to lose an object, but to feel a small loss of self. Psychologists have demonstrated this effect in countless studies. In a classic experiment, participants were given an ordinary coffee mug. After just a few minutes, those given the mug valued it at almost twice the price offered by those who were not given one. The difference was not in the mug, but in the shift from that to mine. The same pattern appears with lottery tickets, pens, snacks, and even virtual items in games. As soon as ownership is established, value inflates, sometimes dramatically, always irrationally. The endowment effect is not limited to material goods. It operates in relationships, opinions, routines, and even memories. The longer you hold on to something, a friendship, a belief, a habit, the harder it is to give up, even when it no longer serves you. You defend your point of view, not just because you believe it, but because it is yours. You hesitate to change careers, cities, or identities, not because the current version is best, but because it is familiar, possessed, endowed. This bias is rooted in loss aversion, a principle that says the pain of losing is felt more strongly than the pleasure of gaining. Once you own something, parting with it feels like a loss. Even if the acquisition itself brought little joy, the mind anchors itself to the status quo, protecting against the discomfort of change. The endowment effect is a way of holding on, of maintaining continuity, of shielding the self from uncertainty. Marketers and sellers exploit this bias. Free trials, try before you buy, or money-back guarantees are designed to create a sense of ownership. Once you picture the product as yours, even temporarily, your mind values it more. Car dealerships encourage test drives. Retailers let you hold or customize before purchase. The strategy works because the endowment effect operates below conscious awareness. You do not realize your sense of value has shifted. You simply feel a stronger pull to keep what you have. The effect also creates clutter, physical, emotional, and psychological. People fill their homes, schedules, and minds with possessions and commitments that were once desirable but are now obsolete. The reluctance to let go leads to accumulation. Closets overflow, inboxes swell, old grudges linger, outdated goals consume attention. Each item feels necessary, not because it is, but because it belongs to you. In negotiations, the endowment effect can cause conflict and stalemate. Sellers demand more than buyers are willing to pay, not out of greed, but out of distorted valuation. Owners of houses, businesses, or family heirlooms often set prices that are far above market value, then feel insulted by realistic offers. The emotional connection to my property outweighs objective measures. This leads to missed opportunities, strained relationships, and, sometimes, financial loss. The endowment effect can also distort collective decision-making. Organizations, governments, and even entire cultures can become attached to outdated systems, laws, or traditions simply because they have owned them for so long. Letting go, even for something better, is resisted. Change threatens the sense of continuity and identity that comes from possession. The cost is not just inertia, but the inability to adapt to new realities. The most subtle danger of the endowment effect is that it closes you off to alternatives. When you overvalue what you have, you become blind to what you could have. The status quo feels safer, but it is often a cage. You turn down new experiences, relationships, and ideas, not because they lack merit, but because they are not yet yours. You cling to what is known, even as it weighs you down. Can you escape the endowment effect? Total escape is unlikely, but awareness can help. When you notice reluctance to let go, pause and ask, would I pay this much to acquire this item, this belief, or this relationship today? If not, the attachment may be more about ownership than true value. Deliberately practice letting go, donate, discard, rethink, revise. The discomfort will pass, and the clarity that comes with release can be profound. Challenge the stories you tell about your possessions and attachments. Notice when mine is the only reason you value something. In decisions, imagine yourself as a newcomer. Would you fight to keep this, or would you let it pass? Ask friends, colleagues, or mentors for honest feedback. Sometimes, an outside perspective is needed to see the distortion clearly. When working in groups or organizations, question the attachment to tradition or precedent. What is being preserved, and why? Is it still useful, or simply familiar? Create rituals for review and renewal. Regularly assess what should be kept and what should be released. The willingness to let go is often the first step toward meaningful change. The endowment effect cannot be entirely erased, but it can be balanced by curiosity and openness. When you recognize the mind's tendency to overvalue what is already owned, you gain the freedom to choose with intention rather than inertia. You learn to separate value from possession, to see possibilities beyond the current inventory of your life. In the end, the objects, ideas, and identities you own do not define you. The mind's attachment to mine is strong, but it is not destiny. To live fully is to recognize the pull of ownership and to let go, when necessary, so that you can move freely toward what matters next. The true value of anything is not just in having, but in being able to release and begin again. The false consensus trap. Why you assume everyone thinks like you. There is a quiet bias woven into nearly every interaction and belief, a distortion so common that it goes unnoticed even as it shapes your sense of reality. This is the false consensus effect, the tendency to overestimate how much other people share your thoughts, feelings, values, and choices. You assume that your way of seeing the world is not just reasonable, but typical, that your beliefs are not only right, but widely shared, and that your habits and judgments reflect some kind of silent majority. This sense of consensus is comforting. It allows you to feel less alone, more certain, more justified. But it is an illusion, a trap that closes off curiosity, weakens empathy, and blinds you to the diversity of human minds. The false consensus effect begins early. Children learn about the world through the lens of their own experiences. They assume their families, customs, and preferences are normal, sometimes struggling to grasp that other children's lives could be so different. As people grow, they build communities, identities, and groups around shared beliefs. It becomes easy to imagine that most reasonable people see things the same way. In reality, what feels universal is usually just familiar, repeated, and close at hand. This illusion is reinforced by the structure of daily life. You spend time with people who resemble you in values, interests, or habits. Social media algorithms feed you content that matches your views, while your physical environment surrounds you with signals of cultural and social similarity. Each interaction, each headline, each conversation subtly confirms your sense of how things are. When you encounter disagreement, it feels jarring, even wrong. The tendency is to dismiss it as exceptional or misguided, rather than to question your own assumptions. The false consensus trap is not just about beliefs. It also affects judgments about behavior and morality. If you consider yourself honest, It's easy to imagine most people are basically honest. If you are punctual, you notice and expect punctuality in others. When someone acts differently, your first instinct is often to attribute it to circumstance, confusion, or error, rather than to accept that different priorities or values exist. This bias leads to frustration, disappointment, and even moral outrage when others do not conform to what you believe is standard or obvious. In group dynamics, the trap becomes even stronger. Once a consensus is established, even informally, individuals are less likely to challenge it. Dissenting voices often remain silent, afraid of social isolation or conflict. As a result, the apparent agreement grows more solid. Regardless of the actual diversity of opinion, the group becomes an echo chamber, where everyone assumes everyone else agrees. Even as private doubts or differences go unspoken, the effect has real consequences for decision-making, policy, and personal growth. In organizations, leaders may believe their vision is widely supported, when in fact, many disagree in silence. In politics, parties overestimate the popularity of their positions, misreading the quiet opposition that never speaks up. In personal life, people misjudge friends, partners, or even strangers, assuming shared values where there is only surface similarity. The result is not just misunderstanding, but missed opportunities for learning, adaptation, and genuine connection. Psychological studies make the effect clear. In experiments, participants are asked their opinion on a topic and then estimate how many others agree. Consistently, people predict far greater agreement than actually exists. When shown that most people disagree, they are surprised, sometimes even defensive. The bias is persistent. It survives education, experience, and even direct contradiction. The mind returns, again and again, to the comforting assumption that most people are like me. This trap is reinforced by cognitive ease. It takes less effort to project your own beliefs than to imagine alternatives. The mind, always searching for shortcuts, uses itself as a template. When you meet someone new, you unconsciously map your own personality onto them, assuming similar preferences, values, and reactions. When the evidence doesn't fit, you are more likely to rationalize or explain it away than to change your underlying assumptions. The false consensus effect is also fueled by the need for validation. Believing that others agree with you increases confidence and reduces social anxiety. It gives you permission to act, to speak, to push your ideas forward. The risk of being in the minority feels threatening, even dangerous, to the social mind. The illusion of consensus is a psychological shield, a way to feel safer, more secure, more at home in the world. However, this shield has a cost. It narrows your vision, creating blind spots and barriers. You become less curious about others, less open to genuine difference, less able to learn from what challenges your assumptions. Empathy suffers, because understanding someone who is truly different requires letting go of the belief that you already know how they think. Creativity suffers, because new ideas rarely come from repeating what is already agreed upon. Progress suffers, because change depends on seeing and engaging with real diversity, not just imagined consensus. The false consensus trap can be subtle in everyday life. When you discuss news, movies, or politics with friends, notice how often people say, "Everyone knows," "Of course," or "It's obvious." These phrases signal the presence of consensus bias, assumptions that are rarely checked. When disagreement surfaces, it may be brushed aside with laughter, sarcasm, or quiet discomfort, rather than explored with curiosity. The effect also appears in conflict. When you argue, you may feel sure that you represent the majority view, while the other side is out of touch. This certainty can turn disagreements into battles for validation, rather than opportunities for understanding. The more certain you are that everyone agrees, the less willing you become to listen, compromise, or reflect. So, how can you escape the false consensus trap? The first step is self-awareness. Notice when you assume agreement. Pause and question whether your sense of consensus is based on evidence or just familiarity. Seek out disagreement, not to win arguments, but to learn what others actually think. Ask genuine questions, and listen to the answers without judgment or defensiveness. Broaden your circles, online and offline. Deliberately expose yourself to people, ideas, and cultures that differ from your own. When reading or listening, pay attention to dissenting voices, not just those that echo your own. In groups, encourage others to speak their minds, and create safety for difference. Remember that silence is not the same as agreement. Often, it is just caution. In personal reflection, ask yourself, if I were raised in another place, time, or family, would I see things the same way? If not, what makes my view universal? What assumptions am I making about what others think? And how could I check them? The habit of humility, of recognizing the limits of your own perspective, opens the door to real connection. Leaders, teachers, and parents can help by modeling curiosity and respect for difference. Celebrate diversity, not just as an abstract value, but as a practical tool for growth and problem solving. Invite dissent, reward honesty, and avoid the trap of seeking validation at the expense of learning. Negativity bias. Why the bad always feels more real than the good. There is a tendency within the human mind that feels so natural you may not even recognize it as a bias. It is the pull of the negative, the quiet gravity that gives bad news, harsh words, and painful memories more weight than the positive moments that surround them. This is negativity bias, the brain's built-in inclination to notice, remember, and react more strongly to unpleasant events than to pleasant ones. The result is a life that feels more dangerous, more disappointing, and more stressful than it really is, simply because the mind treats pain as more real than pleasure. This bias is not just an attitude or a habit. It is a product of evolution, a survival mechanism that once kept your ancestors alive. In a world filled with threats, those who paid more attention to danger, loss, and conflict were more likely to survive. Missing a good opportunity was rarely fatal. Missing a threat could be. As a result, the brain developed to respond more quickly and intensely to negative stimuli. It scans the environment for bad news, remembers insults and failures, and replays past traumas with a clarity that joys and compliments rarely receive. You can see the evidence of negativity bias in daily life. A single criticism can overshadow 100 compliments. A day with one unpleasant encounter is remembered as a bad day, even if the rest was uneventful or pleasant. When reading the news, negative stories dominate your memory, shaping your sense of how the world really is. In relationships, arguments and disappointments linger in your mind, while happy moments fade, even in your own self-talk. Harsh judgments echo louder than kind ones. This pattern is not just anecdotal, it is measurable. Psychological research shows that people require several positive experiences to offset a single negative one. In relationships, couples need at least 5 positive interactions to balance one negative encounter. In work, employees remember criticism longer than praise. When asked to recall memories, people bring up losses, rejections, and regrets more easily than successes and joys. The negative is not only noticed first, it sticks, shaping mood, perception, and even future behavior. Negativity bias affects how you see others. 2. A minor mistake or flaw can color your entire impression of a person, while their positive traits are overlooked or minimized. When meeting someone new, the mind is quick to spot faults and slow to trust. When reflecting on yourself, you may dwell on failures and ignore progress, creating a sense of inadequacy that is out of proportion to reality. This bias distorts risk perception because threats and dangers feel more real. You overestimate their likelihood and underestimate your ability to cope. News of crime, disaster, or conflict makes the world seem more hostile than it is. You become cautious, even fearful, avoiding opportunities and connections because the possibility of loss outweighs the promise of gain. The mind's intention is to keep you safe, but the cost is often anxiety, pessimism, and a shrinking sense of what is possible. The impact of negativity bias can be seen in collective behavior. Societies respond more quickly to scandals, violence, or economic downturns than to progress, peace, or prosperity. Elections are won on fear more than hope. Organizations devote more energy to managing crises than to building on strengths. In groups, rumors and complaints spread faster than encouragement or praise. The negative captures attention, drives decisions, and sets the tone for what is considered realistic. Negativity bias also shapes memory and learning. Mistakes, failures, and traumas are encoded more deeply, making them easier to recall and harder to overcome. This can lead to a cycle in which past pain fuels future fear, creating barriers to growth and connection. You remember embarrassment and rejection long after others have forgotten. You may even avoid situations where you could succeed, simply because the risk of negative outcome feels too large. Despite its power, negativity bias is not destiny. With awareness and effort, its grip can be loosened. The first step is to recognize when your attention, memory, or judgment is being hijacked by the negative. Pause when you find yourself replaying criticism or setbacks. Ask whether the event is really as significant as it feels, or whether it is simply louder because it is unpleasant. Deliberately focus on positive experiences. This does not mean ignoring danger or pretending problems do not exist. Instead, it means giving equal weight to what is good, savoring compliments, celebrating small wins, and noticing acts of kindness. Practice gratitude, not as a cliché, but as a way to balance the mind's natural tendency to dwell on what hurts. Keep a record of what goes well, and revisit it when negativity takes over. When relating to others, challenge the instinct to judge or dismiss based on faults. Look for strengths, effort, and intention. In relationships, repair after conflict quickly and invest in positive interaction. Remember that what feels most real is not always most true. In the face of bad news or uncertainty, seek perspective. Notice the stories that get repeated, and ask what is missing from the narrative. The world contains pain and danger, but it also contains progress, resilience, and joy. Balance the stories you consume with those that uplift and inform, not just alarm. If you struggle with self-criticism, practice self-compassion. Speak to yourself as you would to a friend, remembering that your mind is wired to notice the negative more strongly. Allow space for mistakes, and let positive feedback register before moving on. Negativity bias will never disappear entirely. It is a part of the mind's design, a relic of survival in a more dangerous world. But you are not bound by it. With intention, you can choose what to focus on, what to remember, and what to give power. You can remind yourself that the good is real, even when it is quiet. You can create habits and relationships that nourish, not just protect. In the end, the bad will always feel more immediate, more vivid, and more real than the good, unless you decide otherwise. The art of living well is not in ignoring pain, but in refusing to let it define the whole of reality. The mind is drawn to the negative, but it is capable of seeing the whole. Every day, in small choices and big ones, you decide whether to let the bias steer your life or to guide your attention toward balance, hope, and possibility. Optimism bias, how hope becomes denial in disguise. The human mind has an uncanny way of seeing the world through a lens that gently distorts reality. While negativity bias pulls your attention to danger and pain, Optimism bias works in the opposite direction. It is the mind's quiet habit of overestimating the likelihood of positive outcomes and underestimating the chances of difficulty, failure, or harm. This bias is not simply wishful thinking. It is an ingrained, systematic tendency to tilt the odds in your own mental calculations, making hope feel like common sense, and making denial look a lot like courage. The optimism bias begins in small, daily ways. When you make plans, you tend to assume things will go smoothly. You believe you will have more time, more energy, and more resources than experience suggests. When starting a new project, job, or relationship, you focus on the benefits and minimize the risks. Setbacks seem unlikely, obstacles surmountable, and old patterns easy to change. You envision a future in which problems are less likely to occur to you than to others. This isn't just self-esteem, it is a universal pattern, found in people of all backgrounds, cultures, and personalities. This subtle form of self-deception is not without its benefits. Hope is a motivator. Believing in a brighter tomorrow helps you take risks, start new things, and endure hardship. People with strong optimism bias tend to live longer, recover faster from illness, and experience greater well-being. They approach life's challenges with determination and a sense of possibility. In many ways, this bias is a gift, a built-in buffer against despair and apathy. Yet optimism bias is a double-edged sword. Because it feels so natural and so good, it can quietly become denial. When you assume the best, you are less likely to prepare for setbacks, invest in contingencies, or recognize warning signs. The same hope that gives you energy can blind you to real risks. You ignore the fine print, believe you are the exception to the rule, and assume that planning for failure is a kind of pessimism rather than prudence. The result is surprise when things go wrong, disappointment when expectations are not met, and sometimes, costly mistakes. The illusion of control and optimism bias often work together. If you believe that your actions strongly shape outcomes, you are even more likely to believe that good things will come to you through effort and intention. You make optimistic predictions not because of evidence, but because it feels safer, easier, and more comfortable to do so. When the future is uncertain, the mind fills in the blanks with images of success. Psychological studies make the optimism bias visible. When asked to estimate their chances of getting divorced, being in a car accident, or suffering illness, most people place their risk well below average, even when the statistics suggest otherwise. Students overestimate their chances of getting high grades. Entrepreneurs underestimate the risks of failure. Dieters imagine rapid, lasting weight loss, even when given facts. The mind tends to minimize threats to its hopeful narrative. This bias is especially strong when looking to the distant future. You may know, rationally, that life contains suffering and setbacks, but you believe, often unconsciously, that things will work out for you. When the present is difficult, the mind leaps forward to a better scenario. Next year will be different. This time it will work out. I won't make the same mistake again. Hope is persistent, and it is often immune to the lessons of experience. Optimism bias is reinforced by social cues and cultural narratives. Stories of success, resilience, and overcoming the odds are everywhere. You hear about those who made it, not those who struggled and failed. Advice columns, motivational speakers, and advertising all encourage positive thinking, turning hope into a cultural norm. Those who express doubt or caution are labeled as negative, even when their perspective is more realistic. This pressure makes it even harder to see the line between hope and denial. In groups and organizations, collective optimism can override warning signs, leading to overambitious projects, financial bubbles, and policy failures. Leaders want to inspire, not discourage. Teams want to believe in their mission. The result can be groupthink, where honest doubts are suppressed for the sake of morale. The optimism bias can also play out in relationships. At the start, people focus on compatibility, chemistry, and the promise of lasting happiness. They overlook or minimize differences, red flags, or old patterns. When reality asserts itself, the disappointment feels sharper because it was not anticipated. The mind, clinging to its hopeful story, may even rationalize away problems, hoping they will resolve on their own. In personal health, optimism bias can have real costs. People underestimate their risk of illness, ignore symptoms, and delay seeking help. They believe lifestyle changes will be easier than they are, or that consequences will be minimal. This can lead to late diagnoses, preventable crises, and unnecessary suffering. The challenge is not to eradicate hope. Hope is necessary, but to see optimism bias for what it is, a tendency to underestimate risk and overestimate your own immunity to life's difficulties. When you recognize the bias, you can begin to plan more realistically. Preparing for setbacks is not pessimism, but wisdom. You can remain hopeful while also acknowledging uncertainty and preparing for multiple outcomes. Developing realistic optimism is the antidote. This means holding hope while also confronting facts. When making plans, ask yourself, what could go wrong? What will I do if it does? Are there risks I am ignoring? Am I assuming that my experience will be different from the norm? Seek out evidence, not just encouraging stories. Listen to critics and skeptics, not to be discouraged, but to see blind spots. Encourage those around you to do the same. In teams and organizations, make space for honest debate, contingency planning, and dissent. Balance optimism with accountability. Celebrate hope, but reward preparation. In relationships, allow for conversations about challenges as well as dreams. In personal decisions, balance excitement with caution. Optimism bias will always be with you. The mind needs hope the way the body needs rest. But you can learn to see the difference between helpful hope and denial disguised as confidence. When hope becomes an excuse to ignore reality, it leads to unnecessary pain. When hope is coupled with honest assessment and preparation, it becomes a tool for growth. In the end, the world is unpredictable, and no amount of positive thinking can control every outcome. The mind's optimism is a gift, but it can also be a trap. To live well is to cherish hope while making room for difficulty, to plan for obstacles as well as opportunities, to see the world not just as you wish it to be, but as it is. In this balance, hope becomes not denial, but a source of real strength. Sunk cost fallacy. Why you stay committed to what's already lost. There is a moment in almost every life when you find yourself holding on, long after letting go would make more sense. You stay in a job that drains you, a relationship that has run its course, a project that has stalled, or an investment that keeps losing money. What keeps you there is not hope for the future, but something more subtle, the weight of the past. You remember what you've given time, money, effort, or emotion, and it feels impossible to walk away now, not because the future is promising, but because the past is already lost. This is the sunk cost fallacy, a deep and persistent error in judgment that makes the pain of loss feel worse than the benefit of freedom. The sunk cost fallacy operates quietly, whispering in your mind every time you face the prospect of abandoning something you've invested in. The logic is simple but misleading. I can't quit now, I've already put so much in. The mind becomes anchored to what has already been spent, even though those costs cannot be recovered. Every additional hour, dollar, or ounce of energy is justified as protecting what's already been lost, not realizing that nothing can bring it back. This fallacy is rooted in the psychology of loss aversion. The human brain is wired to feel the pain of loss much more intensely than the pleasure of gain. Giving up is experienced not just as a missed opportunity, but as a defeat, a waste that feels unbearable. Letting go means admitting that past efforts, hopes, or dreams did not work out as planned. The sunk cost fallacy helps you avoid this pain, at least temporarily, by encouraging you to double down, to keep going in the hope that the situation will eventually turn around. You can see this bias in every domain of life. In business, companies continue to fund projects that are failing, justifying each new round of investment as necessary to recoup what's already been lost. In relationships, people stay together out of loyalty to the years they've spent, not because the relationship still brings joy or growth. In personal habits, you finish a meal you're not enjoying, watch a movie you don't like, or keep reading a book that no longer interests you, simply because you've already started. The sunk cost fallacy is especially dangerous because it disguises itself as commitment or perseverance. Society values grit and resilience, and the line between not giving up and refusing to let go is easily blurred. But true perseverance is about pursuing goals that still matter, not clinging to losses that cannot be undone. The sunk cost fallacy keeps you stuck, not because of what you stand to gain, but because of what you're unwilling to lose. Psychological studies make this pattern clear. When participants are asked to choose between abandoning a losing investment or putting in more money, they almost always choose to invest more, even when it is clear that the money will not be recovered. The pain of loss is so strong that rational analysis is overridden. The longer or deeper the investment, the harder it is to walk away. This is why gamblers keep betting, why companies chase failed products, and why people remain in situations that no longer serve them. Memory and emotion reinforce the fallacy. You remember not just what you've lost, but how much it meant to you. You replay moments of hope, effort, and sacrifice, magnifying the sense that giving up would betray everything you have already given. Each additional step is justified by the last, creating a chain of commitment that is difficult to break. The fallacy also interacts with the desire to appear consistent, to yourself and to others. Admitting that you were wrong, or that your efforts were wasted, feels like a personal failure. The mind prefers to rewrite the story, to rationalize the ongoing commitment as strategic, loyal, or optimistic. In groups and organizations, no one wants to be the person who cuts losses or abandons ship, so the cycle continues. The cost of the sunk cost fallacy is not just wasted resources, but missed opportunities. Every hour, dollar, or ounce of effort poured into a losing cause is time and energy that could have gone elsewhere, into something new, something that could grow. The longer you hold on, the more trapped you feel, and the harder it becomes to start fresh. Breaking free from this bias requires a shift in perspective. The first step is to recognize that what's lost is already gone, no matter how much you want it back. When making decisions, ask yourself, if I were starting fresh today, knowing what I know now, would I make this same choice? If the answer is no, the rational move is to let go, regardless of what's already been spent. Practice reframing loss as a lesson, not as a failure. Every investment of time, energy, or emotion brings learning, even if the outcome is not what you hoped for. Allow yourself to grieve what's gone, but refuse to let it dictate your future. The willingness to let go is not weakness, but wisdom, the recognition that freedom is more valuable than trying to fix what cannot be fixed. In organizations and relationships, encourage honest conversations about sunk costs. Create space for people to voice doubts, to admit when something isn't working, and to make new choices without fear of shame or blame. Celebrate adaptability, not just perseverance. Remember that growth comes from moving forward, not from clinging to the past. The sunk cost fallacy cannot be eliminated entirely. The mind will always feel the sting of loss, and the desire to make things right will remain strong. But with practice, you can learn to notice when you are being pulled by the past, and to choose freedom over regret. Each time you let go, you reclaim energy and attention for what is possible. not just for what is lost. In the end, the past is a story, one that can inform your choices, but should never dictate them. The sunk cost fallacy tries to keep you loyal to what's gone, to make the pain of loss feel larger than the promise of something new. The art of living well is to honor what you've given, learn from what didn't work, and step forward, lightened by letting go, not weighed down by what can never be recovered. The halo effect. When one good trait blinds you to all the bad, you meet someone for the first time, and within moments, your mind forms a silent impression. Maybe it's their smile, the way they carry themselves, the warmth in their greeting, or even just the shape of their face. Suddenly, without any real evidence, you find yourself believing that they must be smart, kind, competent, or trustworthy, perhaps all at once. You don't question where this certainty comes from. It feels natural, automatic, even logical. But it is not logic. It is the halo effect, the tendency to let a single positive trait or first impression color your entire judgment of a person or thing, blinding you to flaws and distorting your sense of reality. The halo effect is not confined to first meetings. It operates everywhere, at work, at home, in schools, in politics, in friendships. You see someone perform well in one area and assume they are equally good in others. You notice one admirable trait and, without realizing it, assign a constellation of virtues to the same person. The mind craves coherence, a sense of order. It prefers a simple story. Good people are good. Bad people are bad. The halo effect is the shortcut the mind takes to create that story. This bias is rooted in the brain's tendency to conserve mental energy. Rather than evaluate each aspect of a person or object separately, you make global judgments based on the most salient trait available. A confident speaker is assumed to be knowledgeable. An attractive person is seen as friendly or talented. A successful leader is believed to be moral or wise. Each positive trait acts as a halo, casting a glow over everything else, obscuring flaws, inconsistencies, and warning signs. The effect is not limited to people. Companies, brands, and even products are subject to the same distortion. If you have a good experience with one product from a brand, you are likely to expect the same from their other products. If a politician delivers an inspiring speech, you may overlook questionable policies or past behaviors. When a celebrity is beloved for their work, fans are quick to defend them against accusations or scandals. The halo protects, shields, and sometimes enables patterns of behavior that deserve closer scrutiny. The consequences of the halo effect can be subtle or profound. In schools, teachers may give higher grades to students they find likable, attractive, or well-behaved, regardless of their actual performance. In the workplace, managers may promote or reward employees who make a strong impression, even if their results are average. In courtrooms, jurors are influenced by the defendant's demeanor, grooming, or charisma, impacting verdicts and sentences. The same pattern shapes romantic relationships, where initial chemistry blinds people to incompatibility, or even abuse. The halo effect is self-reinforcing. Once you have assigned a positive label to someone, your mind becomes more likely to interpret ambiguous behaviors in a favorable light. Small mistakes are excused or overlooked. Negative feedback is discounted. Over time, the person's reputation becomes untouchable, insulated by the initial glow. The opposite is also true. A single negative trait can create a horns effect, where everything about the person is judged more harshly. Psychological research shows just how powerful this bias is. In classic experiments, people rated attractive individuals as more intelligent, ethical, and likable, even when given no evidence to support these judgments. In workplace evaluations, a single positive review led managers to rate employees higher across unrelated categories. The mind, in its search for simplicity and certainty, fills in the gaps with positive assumptions. The halo effect is not always harmful. Sometimes, it can build confidence, trust, and goodwill, but it becomes dangerous when it blinds you to real flaws, risks, or patterns of harm. In organizations, the halo effect can allow toxic leaders or practices to go unchecked. In personal life, it can lead to disappointment, betrayal, or even danger when reality breaks through the illusion. The pain is sharper because the trust was total. Recognizing the halo effect is the first step in weakening its grip. Notice when your positive impression of someone is influencing unrelated judgments. Ask yourself, am I evaluating each aspect independently, or am I letting one trait color the whole? Seek out evidence that contradicts your initial impression, and be open to revising your opinion. In groups or organizations, encourage a culture of honest feedback and multiple perspectives to counterbalance the bias. The halo effect also calls for humility. Remind yourself that everyone, no matter how impressive, has flaws, limitations, and contradictions. No one is as perfect as they seem in the glow of first admiration. When making important decisions about hiring, promotion, partnerships, or relationships, take time to look beyond the surface. Deliberately ask for input from people who see things differently. Be wary of your own halos as well. If others treat you with uncritical admiration, remember that their perception may not match reality. Resist the temptation to believe your own press. Seek honest feedback, and remain open to growth and self-examination. The mind is drawn to positive illusions, but wisdom lies in seeing the whole. In society, the halo effect shapes culture and politics. Leaders and celebrities who are charismatic or skilled in one area are often granted authority in areas where they have no expertise. Popularity becomes a substitute for substance. The results can be disappointing or, in some cases, catastrophic. To counteract the halo effect, cultivate skepticism and curiosity. When someone impresses you, ask what you might be missing. When you find yourself drawn to a brand or idea, look for data and dissenting opinions. Practice separating traits, skills, and actions in your evaluations. Encourage diversity of opinion in decision-making, so the glow of the halo does not overshadow what matters most. In the end, the halo effect is a reminder of the mind's longing for simplicity, order, and certainty. It feels good to admire, to trust, to believe in someone or something wholeheartedly. But the truth is always more complex. People are a mix of strengths and weaknesses. Situations contain both promise and risk. To see clearly is to look beyond the glow, to notice what the light does not reach, and to balance your admiration with realism. The mind will always seek shortcuts, and the halo effect is one of its quietest, most seductive traps. But with awareness, you can resist its pull. You can honor the good without ignoring the bad. You can seek out the whole story, rather than being blinded by a single shining trait. In doing so, you not only protect yourself from disappointment, you also make space for real understanding, deeper connection, and a life lived in full awareness of both light and shadow. Ingroup bias, why loyalty can turn into intellectual blindness. From the very beginning of life, the instinct to belong is one of the strongest forces shaping the human mind. Family, tribe, team, nation, culture, everywhere you look. The desire for connection and identification weaves itself through behavior, beliefs, and emotions. At its best, this loyalty brings safety, support, and meaning. It's how you find your place in the world and how society is built. But beneath this sense of unity lies a powerful distortion, in-group bias, the tendency to favor those who are like us and to see the world through the narrow lens of group loyalty. What starts as belonging often ends as blindness, a subtle but pervasive form of intellectual distortion that can shut out truth, suppress dissent, and feed division. In-group bias is automatic. You don't choose it. and you rarely notice it operating. The moment you identify with a group, whether it's as small as a family or as vast as a nation, your mind begins to sort the world into us and them. Those on the inside are given the benefit of the doubt. Their mistakes are minimized, and their successes celebrated. Those on the outside are judged more harshly, their motives questioned, and their contributions undervalued. The mind's reasoning is bent to serve the emotional need for loyalty and affirmation. This bias emerges early in life. Children quickly learn to root for their team, their classroom, or their family. Experiments show that even when group assignment is arbitrary, based on a meaningless color or random label, people still show preference for their in-group, allocating more resources, trust, and goodwill to their own. This pattern persists into adulthood, growing stronger with each new layer of identification. Sports, politics, religion, profession, nationality. The more you invest in a group, the more natural it feels to defend, protect, and celebrate its members, sometimes at the expense of fairness or even basic reason. In-group bias can be comforting. It creates a sense of certainty, belonging, and shared reality. Group loyalty provides support in times of crisis, amplifies joy in moments of success, and offers protection against outsiders. The rituals, stories, and symbols of belonging become anchors for identity and meaning. It feels good to be part of something larger, to know where you stand, and to see your values reflected by those around you. Yet, the comfort of the group comes at a cost. In-group bias narrows your vision, making it difficult to see the flaws or limitations within your own group. Criticism from outsiders is dismissed, no matter how valid. Dissent within the group is discouraged, labeled as betrayal or negativity. The pressure to conform can become overwhelming, silencing minority voices and suppressing honest debate. Over time, the group becomes insulated from feedback, growing more certain and less aware. This intellectual blindness has real consequences. In organizations, teams may ignore warning signs or dismiss innovative ideas simply because they come from outside. Political parties polarize, each convinced of their own righteousness and the other's corruption. Nations slide into conflict, fueled by mutual suspicion and the need to protect their own at all costs. Even in families and friendships, in-group bias can prevent healing, perpetuate misunderstanding, and create lasting divisions. Psychological studies reveal just how powerful this bias can be. When evaluating identical actions or statements, people judge them more favorably if they come from a member of their own group. Group identity colors memory, perception, and reasoning. You remember successes and contributions from your group, while forgetting or rationalizing failures and harms. Even values and morals can become flexible, bending to protect the in-group's reputation or interests. In-group bias is not just about exclusion. It also feeds on comparison. The mind is quick to exaggerate differences between groups, emphasizing what divides rather than what unites. Stereotypes and prejudices take root, reinforced by stories, rituals, and selective memory. When your group is criticized, you feel attacked. When another group is praised, you feel threatened. The need for positive distinctiveness drives not only loyalty, but also competition, resentment, and even hostility. The social cost of in-group bias is profound. Societies become fragmented, trust erodes, and collaboration breaks down. The echo chambers of modern media amplify these divisions, creating bubbles where each group hears only its own version of reality. Dialogue is replaced by debate by outrage, and outrage by silence or violence. The mind's need for belonging, left unchecked, becomes a barrier to understanding. But in-group bias also operates quietly in everyday life. At work, you might overlook the contributions of a colleague from another department. In school, you stick with friends who share your background. ignoring opportunities to connect across lines. In families, loyalty sometimes keeps harmful secrets or perpetuates unfair traditions. The cost is subtle but real: missed opportunities for learning, growth, and connection. Can you escape in-group bias? Complete escape is unlikely. The need for belonging is part of being human, but you can reduce its power with intention and awareness. The first step is humility, recognizing that your group, no matter how cherished, is not immune to error, limitation, or even harm. Make a habit of seeking out perspectives from outside your group. Listen with curiosity, not just to agree or rebut, but to understand. Encourage dissent and diversity within your group. Celebrate those who ask hard questions or challenge consensus. Value loyalty not just to the group, but to truth, fairness, and growth. When conflicts arise, look for common ground, shared values, and mutual interests, rather than retreating to defensiveness. Be willing to examine your own thinking. When you catch yourself dismissing someone because they are not one of us, pause and question the reflex. What are you protecting? What are you afraid to see or admit? Practice empathy, remembering that every them is someone else's us. The boundaries between groups are often artificial, maintained by habit and fear rather than reality. In leadership, foster environments where differences are respected, where honesty is rewarded, and where loyalty is not blind but thoughtful. The strength of a group is not in sameness, but in its ability to adapt, grow, and welcome challenge. In the end, in-group bias is a reflection of the mind's deepest needs for safety, connection, and meaning. Loyalty, at its best, builds bridges and nurtures courage. But when it turns into intellectual blindness, it traps you in narrowness and division. The art of belonging is to hold your group close, but not so close that you cannot see beyond it, to value your community, but never at the expense of your own mind. True loyalty is not silent agreement, but the willingness to question, to grow, and to choose truth even when it is uncomfortable. Only then does belonging enrich your life, rather than limit it. Hindsight bias. Why the mind pretends it knew the outcome all along. It is a quiet conviction that creeps in after the fact, so subtle that it feels less like a distortion and more like a memory. You look back at a decision, an event, or a piece of history and realize, almost with certainty, that the outcome was obvious. You find yourself saying, "I knew it all along," as if your past self had seen what was coming. This is hindsight bias, the mind's tendency to believe, after the outcome is known, that it was predictable, inevitable, and even apparent from the beginning. Hindsight bias quietly erases uncertainty, smooths over ambiguity, and convinces you that your understanding of the past was always as clear as it is now. This bias begins the moment results are revealed. A stock market crash, an election upset, a surprising sports victory, or a medical diagnosis. After the news arrives, you reconstruct your memory of what you thought, noticed, or predicted before it happened. Doubts and alternative scenarios fade. The story tightens, and what once felt uncertain becomes a straight line from cause to effect. You may not notice the change. It feels like clarity, like wisdom gained through experience. In truth, it is the mind's subtle rewriting of history, a way of claiming more foresight than actually existed. The roots of hindsight bias lie in the brain's need for coherence and control. Uncertainty and randomness are unsettling. They threaten your sense of agency and make the world feel unpredictable. When the outcome is revealed, the mind rushes to close the gap, to explain why things happened as they did. You gather evidence from memory, clues, warning signs, gut feelings, and rearrange them to fit the result. The process is unconscious, fast, and persistent. What was once doubtful becomes, in memory, a certainty that never wavered. This rewriting happens in big ways and small. After a test, you remember being confident about the answers you got right, and almost changing the ones you missed. After a relationship ends, you recall subtle signals of trouble that seemed unimportant at the time, but now feel like glaring red flags. After a crisis at work, you remember having had a feeling that something was wrong. Even if you dismissed it in the moment, the mind retells the story, strengthening the parts that match the outcome and fading the ones that do not. Hindsight bias is not just about personal memory. It shapes collective narratives as well. In history, events that were complex and uncertain in real time are retold as if their outcomes were inevitable. Political revolutions, financial bubbles, and technological breakthroughs are explained as the logical result of forces that, at the time, were anything but clear. The messiness of reality is replaced by a tidy chain of causes and effects. The heroes and villains emerge. The key decisions are highlighted, and everything else fades into the background. This illusion of predictability has consequences. It breeds overconfidence, both in your judgment and in the wisdom of hindsight itself. When you believe that outcomes were obvious, you underestimate the uncertainty that existed and judge yourself, or others, too harshly for not seeing what should have been clear. It becomes easier to blame, to second-guess, and to dismiss the real complexity of decision-making. In organizations, hindsight bias can cripple learning. When reviewing failures or successes, teams often believe that the right course of action should have been obvious. They forget the ambiguity and noise that surrounded the decision in real time. Leaders punish mistakes that, at the time, were not clearly mistakes at all. The result is a culture where people avoid risk, creativity, or dissent, fearing that the future will be judged by a standard of false certainty. Hindsight bias also makes it harder to improve your own judgment. If you believe you knew it all along, you do not examine the real reasons for your predictions, whether you were relying on evidence, intuition, or wishful thinking. The learning that comes from honest self-reflection is lost, replaced by the comfort of being right after the fact. The next time uncertainty arises, you are no better prepared. The cycle repeats. Psychological studies reveal the depth of this bias. In experiments, participants are told the outcome of an event and then asked what they would have predicted before knowing. Consistently, people report that the result was obvious, regardless of the actual likelihood. Even when warned about hindsight bias, or when paid to avoid it, the effect remains strong. The mind insists on retroactively inflating its foresight. Hindsight bias is reinforced by storytelling. The mind loves a coherent narrative, and knowing the outcome allows you to edit the plot, the characters, and the clues to fit. Randomness and luck are edited out. The narrative becomes smooth and satisfying, but at the expense of truth. What could have happened, but didn't, is forgotten. The outcome becomes the only reality that matters. You see this pattern in every aspect of life. In sports, victories are explained as inevitable, the result of destiny or momentum. In business, failed ventures are dismissed as foolish from the start. In personal life, decisions that go badly are blamed on overlooked details that, in the moment, were not so clear. The mind is a relentless editor, recasting uncertainty as certainty, rewriting ignorance as insight. Is it possible to resist hindsight bias? Not entirely. The tendency to see the past as more predictable than it was is deeply rooted. But you can reduce its power with deliberate practice. When reflecting on events, remind yourself of what you actually knew at the time. Keep records, journals, notes, emails that capture your genuine uncertainty and thought process. After an outcome, review these records to see how your memory shifts. When judging others, practice empathy for the decisions they faced in the moment, not with the benefit of hindsight. Remember that ambiguity and risk are always clearer after the fact. In organizations, create processes that value honest discussion of uncertainty and reward learning from mistakes, not just success. Resist the urge to tidy up the past. When making decisions, acknowledge the limits of your knowledge. Embrace uncertainty as a part of life, not as a flaw to be eliminated. The world is unpredictable, and outcomes are often the result of chance, complexity, and forces beyond anyone's control. True wisdom lies in humility, the willingness to admit what you did not know, even when the story you tell yourself says otherwise. In the end, hindsight bias is a quiet distortion, a way for the mind to protect itself from the discomfort of uncertainty. It feels like clarity, but it is only a story told by memory. To live and learn honestly is to resist the urge to say, "I knew it all along," and instead to remember how much was unknown, how many futures were possible, and how hard it is to see clearly when looking forward, not back. In that humility is the chance for real understanding and real growth. The Dunning-Kruger effect, when ignorance dresses itself as certainty. There is a paradox at the heart of human knowledge. The less you know, the more confident you feel. This phenomenon is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, a bias that leads those with little skill or knowledge to overestimate their abilities, while those with expertise are often filled with self-doubt. It is not just a quirk of personality, but a systematic distortion in how the mind judges itself. The danger is quiet but profound: ignorance, unaware of its own limits, parades as certainty, while true wisdom is shadowed by caution and humility. The Dunning-Kruger effect begins with a simple problem. When you know little about a subject, you lack not only knowledge, but also the self-awareness to see your limitations. The very skills and facts you need to understand a domain are the same ones required to evaluate your own competence. Without this foundation, you cannot see the gaps in your understanding. Instead, you rely on surface impressions, confidence, and the illusion of clarity. In this way, ignorance dresses itself up as expertise, and the mind mistakes the comfort of certainty for the substance of knowledge. This bias is visible everywhere, from casual conversation to the highest levels of leadership. In workplaces, inexperienced employees may offer bold solutions or challenge experts, convinced they see the whole picture. In public debate, those with shallow knowledge speak loudest, dismissing complexity as overthinking. On social media, misinformation spreads quickly, amplified by voices that sound certain, even as they misrepresent or misunderstand the facts. Meanwhile, those with true expertise hedge their statements, speak in probabilities, and warn of uncertainty, qualities that can be mistaken for weakness or lack of conviction. The Dunning-Kruger effect was first described in psychological studies where people were asked to rate their skills in areas like grammar, logic, or humor. Again and again, the least competent participants rated themselves well above average, while the most competent underestimated their relative ability. The explanation is straightforward. To recognize excellence requires a minimum level of skill or knowledge. Without it, mistakes go unseen and gaps remain invisible. The effect is not just a problem for the unskilled. It is a challenge for everyone, at every level of expertise. The more you learn about a subject, the more aware you become of its complexity, the unknowns, and your own limitations. This is why experts often qualify their opinions, reference conflicting evidence, or seem reluctant to speak in absolutes. Their caution is not indecision, but a sign of understanding. In contrast, the novice, unburdened by knowledge of the unknown, moves quickly to conclusions and speaks with conviction. This asymmetry creates problems in communication and decision-making. Those who know least may dominate discussions, set the tone for groups, or even take charge in crises. Their confidence is persuasive, not because it is justified, but because the mind is drawn to certainty, especially in times of doubt. Those who could offer deeper insight may remain silent, doubting themselves or feeling drowned out. The result is that groups, organizations, and even societies can be led astray, not by malice, but by misplaced confidence. The Dunning-Kruger effect is reinforced by cultural values. Societies often reward confidence, self-assurance, and quick decision-making. The can-do attitude, the willingness to take charge, and the ability to speak without hesitation are celebrated, while caution, nuance, and humility can be seen as weak. This creates incentives for the unskilled to assert themselves and for the skilled to hold back. Psychologically, the bias is fueled by the brain's need for coherence and simplicity. It feels good to have answers, to be right, to resolve uncertainty. When faced with a complex problem, the mind gravitates toward the most accessible explanation, mistaking fluency for truth. The less you know, the fewer doubts you have. The more you learn, the more aware you become of how much there is to learn. Knowledge expands, but so does humility. The Dunning-Kruger effect also has social consequences. In teams, overconfident members may take unnecessary risks, ignore warning signs, or dismiss valuable input. Leaders who do not recognize their own limitations can make costly mistakes. In politics and public life, charismatic figures with little expertise can sway opinion, setting policies or making promises that ignore complexity. The harm is often hidden until the consequences arrive. Yet, the effect is not always visible from the inside. If you are caught by it, you may feel genuine certainty, unaware of your limitations. The mind protects itself from discomfort by inflating its sense of competence. Even when mistakes are made, they are explained away, or blamed on circumstances. The hardest thing to see is your own ignorance, especially when it is dressed as knowledge. Escaping the Dunning-Kruger effect requires humility, a willingness to question yourself, to seek feedback, and to recognize that confidence is not the same as competence. The first step is curiosity. Ask what you do not know. Seek out expert perspectives, and remain open to being corrected. Surround yourself with people who challenge your thinking, rather than just affirming it. Practice distinguishing between confidence and evidence. When someone sounds certain, ask what supports their claims. When you feel sure of yourself, pause and check whether your knowledge is deep or just comfortable. Value those who admit uncertainty or who qualify their opinions. They may be seeing the parts of the problem you are missing. In organizations, create cultures that reward learning, not just knowing. Encourage people to ask questions, admit mistakes, and seek advice. Make it safe to say, "I don't know." The greatest risk is not ignorance itself, but ignorance pretending to be knowledge. In your own growth, remember that feeling less certain as you learn more is a sign of progress, not failure. Embrace the humility that comes from genuine understanding. The world is vast, complex, and filled with unknowns. The more you learn, the more you discover what you have yet to learn. This is not a weakness, but a path to real wisdom. In the end, the Dunning-Kruger effect is a quiet warning. The mind is quick to fill the gaps in knowledge with certainty, and slow to admit how much remains unseen. To live wisely is to hold your opinions lightly, to check confidence against evidence, and to remember that true mastery begins with humility. Ignorance will always try to dress itself as certainty, but real understanding wears the quieter cloak of doubt, patience, and the willingness to keep learning. Moral licensing. How one good act lets you justify the next bad one. Within the mind's quiet machinery, there exists a peculiar loophole in the system of self-regulation, a subtle bias that allows you to feel justified in making questionable choices after doing something virtuous. This is moral licensing, the tendency for a single good deed to unconsciously grant permission for a subsequent bad one. It is a pattern so familiar that you might not even recognize it as a bias, but rather mistake it for balance, fairness, or self-compassion. Yet, in the background, it quietly undermines your values and distorts your sense of right and wrong. Moral licensing begins with a moment of virtue. Perhaps you donate to charity, recycle diligently, offer help to a stranger, or make a difficult but ethical decision at work. The action is sincere, and it genuinely affirms your sense of being a good person. In the aftermath, however, something unexpected happens. The mind, having established its goodness, relaxes its standards. The next temptation, a selfish indulgence, a shortcut, a small dishonesty, feels less threatening, less out of character. The good deed has, in effect, purchased moral credit that can now be spent. This phenomenon is not simply rationalization after the fact. It is a shift in mental accounting that happens beneath awareness. The mind keeps an invisible scorecard of virtue, and after each good act, the balance feels positive enough to tolerate a little negative. The result is a cycle, moments of moral rigor interspersed with lapses, each one justified by what came before. In this way, moral licensing creates a permission slip for future missteps. The effect is visible in all areas of life. After a healthy meal, you treat yourself to dessert, justifying it as a reward. After a productive work session, you spend the next hour procrastinating, believing you've earned the break. When you drive a fuel-efficient car, you might drive more miles, undoing the environmental benefit. In relationships, an act of patience or kindness can be followed by a burst of irritation or neglect, each rationalized by the memory of prior goodness. In politics and leadership, a public gesture of virtue can provide cover for less ethical behavior down the line. Moral licensing is not just about hypocrisy. It is about the mind's need for coherence and self-esteem. Most people want to see themselves as good, moral, and consistent, but because perfection is impossible, the mind seeks ways to balance the ledger. The result is a kind of psychological trade-off, one that feels fair, but rarely is. Each time you spend moral credit, you reinforce the illusion that values can be measured, accumulated, and offset, rather than lived continuously. Psychological studies make the mechanism clear. In experiments, participants who recall a past act of charity are more likely to cheat on a subsequent task or act selfishly in a group. When people purchase green products, they feel licensed to behave less generously in unrelated situations. Even voting for a candidate from a minority group can lead people to later express less support for similar causes, having already affirmed their open-mindedness. The bias operates quietly, invisible until its effects are tallied. The danger of moral licensing is not just personal but collective. In organizations, a single high-profile act of social responsibility can distract from ongoing unethical practices. A company that donates to charity may feel justified in exploiting workers or the environment elsewhere. On a societal level, public gestures of inclusion, justice, or reform can create complacency, making it harder to sustain real change. The more attention is paid to the good, the easier it becomes to overlook the bad. Moral licensing also interacts with other biases, such as confirmation bias and in-group loyalty. When you see yourself as moral, you become more likely to interpret your actions in the best possible light, excusing lapses as exceptions or even as deserved. Within groups, members who have contributed positively may feel entitled to break the rules or act in ways that harm others, expecting loyalty or forgiveness in return. The group's reputation for virtue becomes a shield, blinding both insiders and outsiders to misconduct. The subtlety of moral licensing makes it hard to confront. The acts of goodness are real, and they do deserve recognition. But the mind's accounting system is flawed. It treats morality as if it were a currency to be spent, not a way of being. Over time, this erodes integrity. You become less consistent, less self-aware, and more vulnerable to temptation, all while maintaining the comforting image of yourself as a good person. Resisting moral licensing requires self-honesty and a shift in how you think about values. Instead of seeing virtue as a credit to be spent, See it as a commitment to be renewed with every choice. Each good act is an opportunity to strengthen your character, not to rest on your laurels. When you notice yourself justifying a questionable action by recalling a good one, pause and ask, would this choice stand on its own? Or am I borrowing credit from the past? Develop habits that reinforce consistency. Set clear standards for yourself and revisit them regularly. Seek feedback from trusted friends, mentors, or colleagues who can help you notice patterns of justification. Practice gratitude for your own good actions, but do not let them become a shield against self-examination. Remember that growth comes from continuous effort, not from isolated achievements. In organizations, encourage cultures that value ongoing integrity over one-time gestures. Reward those who act with consistency, not just those who make dramatic contributions. Create systems of accountability that persist beyond moments of public virtue. Challenge yourself and others to see morality as a daily practice, not as a score to be kept. The mind's desire to feel good about itself is natural, but it can become a trap if left unchecked. Moral licensing is a quiet distortion, trading true character for the illusion of balance. To live with integrity is to recognize that every choice matters, that virtue is not a currency to be spent, and that the best reward for a good act is the strength to choose rightly again. In the end, your moral life is not defined by a single good deed, nor undone by a single mistake. It is the sum of your daily choices, the quiet, repeated acts of honesty, kindness, and courage. The mind will always look for ways to justify, to balance, to excuse. The task is to keep returning to your values, not as a shield, but as a compass. Only then can you move through the world with a sense of genuine integrity, consistent, aware, and whole. Survivorship bias. Why you only see the winners and miss the truth. There is an invisible filter that quietly shapes the stories you hear, the lessons you learn, and the judgments you make about success and failure. This is survivorship bias, the mind's tendency to focus on those who make it to the end of a journey, while overlooking the countless others who fell by the wayside. Survivorship bias is the reason why stories of spectacular triumph seem so common, why advice from winners feels universal, and why failure is often dismissed as bad luck or lack of effort. What you see is not the whole truth, but only the part that survived. Survivorship bias begins with a basic error in sampling. Imagine reading about famous entrepreneurs, athletes, or artists who made it big. The world is filled with their advice. Work hard, take risks, follow your passion, never give up. These stories are inspiring, but they are incomplete. For every person who succeeded, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands, who followed the same path, worked just as hard, and risked just as much, but never reached the finish line. Their stories are missing, not because they have nothing to teach, but because they were filtered out by failure. The mind, hungry for patterns, mistakes this narrow view for the whole picture. This bias is everywhere. In business, you study the habits of successful companies, not realizing that many failed businesses did the same things but did not survive to tell the tale. In health, miracle recoveries are celebrated, while those who followed the same treatments but did not survive are forgotten. In war, strategies of victorious armies are dissected, while the plans of the defeated are ignored. In personal life, you hear about the marriages that lasted, the diets that worked, the investments that paid off, and assume that these are the blueprints for success. The failures are invisible, but their absence distorts reality. Survivorship bias is reinforced by culture and media. Success sells stories of victory, perseverance, and luck are repeated endlessly, while stories of loss, error, or randomness are buried. The narrative becomes one of agency and control. Winners succeeded because of what they did. Losers failed because of what they didn't do. The randomness, luck, and sheer unpredictability that mark most journeys are left out. The The result is a world that feels more ordered, more predictable, and more meritocratic than it actually is. The danger of survivorship bias is subtle but profound. It creates unrealistic expectations and pressures. You believe that hard work alone guarantees success. That risk is always rewarded, and that failure is evidence of personal weakness. This leads to disappointment, self-blame, and sometimes reckless decision-making. You are told to think positive, stay hungry, and follow your dreams. But the countless stories of those who did just that and failed are left untold. Psychological studies show how easily this bias shapes perception. In experiments, people are shown only the results of the survivors, whether in business, sports, or academia, and asked to identify patterns or secrets to success. Almost without fail, they attribute success to skill, planning, or attitude, ignoring the role of chance, timing, and external conditions. When the missing data is revealed, the stories of those who did not make it, the illusion collapses, and what seemed like a clear formula becomes a complex web of variables. Survivorship bias also shapes collective memory. Societies remember the victors, the inventions that changed the world, the ideas that took hold. They forget the countless alternatives, the failures, the almosts. This distorts not just how you see the world, but how you prepare for it. The odds of success are misjudged, risks are downplayed, and failures are stigmatized rather than studied. In organizations, survivorship bias can lead to complacency. A company that thrives may attribute its success to strategy or leadership, ignoring the luck or timing that played a crucial role. The same company, facing new challenges, may rely on what worked in the past, blind to the risks and changes in the environment. In investment, people chase hot stocks or industries, following the visible winners, while forgetting the silent majority of failed ventures. The bias is not just a product of stories, but of the mind's need for coherence. You want to believe in a world where effort is rewarded, where patterns can be discerned, and where success is within reach if only you follow the right steps. Survivorship bias feeds this need, offering reassuring narratives that are comforting but incomplete. The reality, messier and more unpredictable, is harder to accept. Escaping survivorship bias requires conscious effort. The first step is to seek out the missing stories, the failures, the ordinary, the forgotten. When reading advice from winners, ask what you are not being told. What about those who tried the same thing and did not succeed? What role did luck, timing, or external factors play? In decision-making, look for data on the full distribution of outcomes, not just the successes. Study mistakes as well as triumphs. In organizations and leadership, create a culture that learns from failure, not just from success. Encourage honest reflection on what didn't work, and be skeptical of stories that seem too simple or certain. In personal growth, balance inspiration with realism. Recognize that the odds of extraordinary success are long, and that failure is not always a sign of weakness or error. Survivorship bias will never disappear completely. The world will always be filled with the stories of winners, and the mind will always gravitate toward patterns that seem clear. But you can remind yourself, again and again, that what you see is only part of the truth. The rest, the invisible stories, the unheralded efforts, the silent losses, are just as real and just as instructive. In the end, wisdom comes from seeing the whole picture, not just the highlights. The world is shaped by both the visible and the unseen, by victory and defeat, by those who made it and those who did not. To live wisely is to honor both, to learn from the full tapestry of experience, and to understand that the truth is bigger, and often humbler, than the stories that survive. The planning fallacy. Why your brain always thinks there's more time. There is a peculiar confidence that emerges every time you make a plan, whether it's a work project, a household task, a journey, or even just getting ready for the day. Your mind estimates how long it will take, often with optimism and conviction. You believe this time will be different. You imagine smooth progress, minimal obstacles, and a finish line met ahead of schedule. Yet, again and again, reality proves otherwise. The deadline slips, the task expands, complications arise, and you find yourself wondering where all the hours went. This is the planning fallacy, the deep-seated tendency for the mind to underestimate the time, resources, and difficulty required to complete future tasks, no matter how many times experience suggests otherwise. The planning fallacy begins with hope and imagination. When you picture the future, you focus on what you intend to do, the ideal steps, and the end result. You overlook, or at least minimize, the potential for interruptions, setbacks, or your own changing motivation. The mind naturally discounts unpleasant details. Instead, it creates a streamlined narrative, one thing after another, each step leading smoothly to the next. The result is an optimistic plan, one that feels realistic as you create it, but rarely survives contact with reality. This bias is not just about personal ambition or carelessness. It is a universal cognitive error, affecting everyone from students to CEOs. Studies show that when asked to estimate how long a task will take, most people go with their best-case scenario. They remember times when things went well, not the many times when things did not, even when reminded of past overruns, or even required to review hard data from previous attempts. People persist in thinking, this time will be different. The planning fallacy is powered by several psychological forces. One is optimism bias, the mind's tendency to expect good outcomes and minimize the chance of trouble. Another is the tendency to focus on your own actions, rather than on external factors beyond your control. You see yourself working efficiently, but you forget about the traffic, the unplanned phone call, the colleague who needs help, or the unexpected delay. The result is a plan that is tailored to what should happen, not to what is likely to happen. Memory also conspires against you. When you recall past projects, you remember the highlights, the moments of flow, the early progress, the satisfaction of finishing. The slowdowns, setbacks, and time lost to distractions are edited out or minimized. The narrative of past success, streamlined and idealized, becomes the basis for new plans. When you make your schedule, you are competing with a memory that never quite matches reality. The planning fallacy is not just a personal problem. It affects groups, organizations, and entire societies. Infrastructure projects, new technologies, and public policies are routinely delayed and over budget. Promises are made based on best-case scenarios, and costs are justified with rosy estimates. When reality intrudes, blame is assigned, but the pattern repeats. Each time, decision-makers believe that better planning, more discipline, or a little luck will make the difference. The consequences of the planning fallacy go beyond inconvenience. Deadlines are missed, opportunities are lost, and resources are wasted. People experience stress, disappointment, and sometimes shame as their optimistic plans unravel. Teams are forced to scramble, improvise, or make compromises. Confidence in leadership can erode, and trust within organizations can suffer. At a deeper level, the planning fallacy is rooted in the human need for control and predictability. When you look to the future, uncertainty is uncomfortable. It is tempting to believe that with enough effort, you can bend events to your will. The mind resists accepting just how much is out of your hands. The planning fallacy is a way of managing anxiety, not by acknowledging risk, but by minimizing it. Is it possible to escape the planning fallacy? Complete escape is unlikely, but there are ways to reduce its power. The first step is to shift your perspective from inside view to outside view. Instead of planning based on your intentions and imagination, look at statistical averages. How long did similar tasks actually take in the past? What were the most common obstacles? What went wrong? And how was it handled? Build in buffers, extra time, resources, and flexibility for the unexpected. Assume that delays and distractions are the rule, not the exception. When making commitments, ask yourself what you will do if things take twice as long or cost twice as much. Share your plans with others and ask for feedback, often. An outside perspective will spot blind spots or unrealistic assumptions you missed. Embrace honest postmortems. After each project, take time to review what actually happened, not just what was planned. Notice where your estimates were off, and adjust future plans accordingly. Make it a habit to track your time, so your memory reflects reality, not just optimism. Resist the pressure to promise what you wish could be true. In organizations and teams, encourage a culture where honesty about uncertainty is valued more than grand promises. Leaders who admit the likelihood of overruns and setbacks are more likely to earn trust in the long run. At a personal level, practice self-compassion. The planning fallacy is not a moral failing, but a cognitive bias. When your schedule slips, or a project takes longer than planned, remind yourself that this is part of being human. Use the experience to refine your approach, not to fuel shame or disappointment. The planning fallacy is a testament to both the creativity and the blindness of the human mind. You are always imagining what could be, building visions of what you want to achieve. But reality is messier, slower, and more unpredictable than any plan. To live and work well is to honor both your optimism and your limits, to plan with hope, but also with humility. In the end, your brain will always think there's more time, more space, and more certainty than there is. The art of planning is not to banish hope, but to pair it with realism, to leave room for the unknown, to expect setbacks, and to build a future that is resilient, not just efficient. In doing so, you give yourself the best chance not just to finish, but to finish well, with wisdom earned from every overrun and every lesson learned along the way. The spotlight effect. Why you think everyone's watching you. There is a peculiar self-consciousness that follows you through daily life, a sense that your actions, appearance, and mistakes are illuminated for all to see. You feel the imaginary spotlight, every misstep, every awkward word, every minor flaw seems exposed, as if an audience is quietly watching and judging. This is the spotlight effect, a deep-rooted cognitive bias that causes you to overestimate how much other people notice and care about your presence. The feeling is subtle but powerful, shaping how you behave, how you remember, and even how you judge yourself. The spotlight effect begins with the simple fact of subjectivity. You are always at the center of your own experience. Every thought, feeling, and sensation is filtered through your perspective. Because your awareness of yourself is constant, it is easy to assume that others are equally attentive to you. The reality, however, is quite different. Most people are absorbed in their own lives, their own concerns, and their own version of the spotlight. What feels like glaring exposure to you is, for others, just background noise. Psychological studies make this pattern clear. In one experiment, participants were asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt, a large, unflattering image, into a room filled with strangers. Afterward, they consistently estimated that about half the people in the room had noticed the shirt. In reality, only a small fraction did. The wearer's heightened self-consciousness created a powerful illusion of scrutiny that was not matched by others' attention. The spotlight effect is not just about clothing or appearance. It colors every aspect of public life. When you stumble over your words in a meeting, forget a name, or make a minor error, you replay the moment, convinced it was as memorable to others as it was to you. When you try something new or step outside your comfort zone, anxiety about being watched or judged can become paralyzing. The fear of embarrassment, more than actual embarrassment, often limits your choices and narrows your experience. This bias is fueled by the mind's tendency to inflate the significance of personal events. Because you experience every moment in vivid detail, you forget that others are rarely paying the same level of attention. Most people are caught up in their own worries, insecurities, and daily tasks. The mind's spotlight, so bright and unyielding, is in reality a dim and scattered light in the eyes of others. The spotlight effect is also intensified by memory. Embarrassing moments stand out. Your mind replays them, searching for mistakes or clues about how you were perceived. You judge yourself harshly, believing others do the same. In truth, most observers quickly forget, if they notice at all, your mistake, which feels monumental in the moment, is usually a passing detail for everyone else. Social media amplifies the spotlight effect. Posts, photos, and updates feel like public performances. The pressure to present well, to be noticed or liked, increases self-consciousness. Every response, or lack of response, seems meaningful, even though most people are only lightly engaged. Scrolling quickly and thinking about themselves, the feeling of being watched grows, even as true attention remains rare. The spotlight effect is not always negative. Sometimes, the belief that you are being observed can encourage good behavior, increase motivation, or prompt self-improvement. But more often, it leads to unnecessary anxiety, caution, and self-doubt. Opportunities are missed because you fear judgment. Experiences are limited because you overestimate the cost of standing out. The cost of the spotlight effect is often isolation. You become reluctant to express yourself honestly, to take risks, or to connect with others in vulnerable ways. The imagined audience becomes a barrier, keeping you from fully participating in life. Even when others try to reassure you, the feeling persists. The spotlight is internal, fueled by your own attention, not by external observation. Escaping the spotlight effect requires a shift in perspective. The first step is to remember that others are as focused on themselves as you are. Their attention is limited, their memory's short, their judgment's fleeting. When you notice yourself replaying an embarrassing moment, pause and ask, how long would I remember if someone else had done the same? What seemed enormous to you is likely invisible or forgotten to others. Practice moving through the world with the assumption that you are not being scrutinized, but simply present, one of many. Give yourself permission to make mistakes, to be imperfect, to take up space. Notice how little you dwell on the minor missteps of others, and extend the same grace to yourself. The world is filled with people worried about their own spotlight, rarely pausing to notice yours. In group settings, focus outward rather than inward. Shift your attention from how you are being perceived to what you can contribute or learn. Ask questions, listen deeply, and connect with others' experiences. The less time you spend in the imaginary spotlight, the more energy you have for authentic engagement. When anxiety rises, remember that discomfort fades. The memory of awkwardness is sharpest for you. For everyone else, it is just a blur in the background of their own concerns. Each time you step forward despite self-consciousness, you weaken the spotlight's grip and gain freedom from its imaginary glare. The spotlight effect cannot be eliminated entirely. The mind will always notice itself most vividly. But with practice, you can shrink the spotlight, quiet the anxiety, and reclaim the possibility of living more boldly and authentically. You are seen, but rarely as much as you fear. The world's attention is scattered, and your life is not a performance for others, but a story to be lived, with all its moments of awkwardness, courage, and connection. In the end, the real spotlight is the one you shine on yourself. When you turn it down, you discover that freedom and self-acceptance grow in the quiet, unnoticed spaces where life actually happens. Egocentric bias. Why everything feels more personal than it really is. Every human life is lived from a single vantage point, the the center of your own consciousness. Every thought, sensation, and emotion is filtered through your personal experience. This is not a flaw, but a fact of existence. Yet, within this private universe, the mind quietly distorts the meaning of events, conversations, and circumstances. This is egocentric bias, the tendency to interpret what happens around you as being more related to you than it actually is. You believe you are noticed more, remembered more, and blamed or praised more than is warranted. Ordinary events become subtly personal, and the ordinary self becomes the imagined focus of other people's lives. The roots of egocentric bias lie in the structure of consciousness. You are always aware of yourself, your feelings, plans, needs, and flaws. When something happens, a comment, a change in mood, a decision at work, you instinctively ask, "How does this affect me?" You replay conversations, wondering what others thought about what you said. When someone is distant or irritable, you search for what you might have done wrong, even when logic suggests otherwise. The mind weaves a story that makes you the main character. This bias is not vanity or arrogance. It is a kind of cognitive shorthand. Since you have more access to your own thoughts and intentions than anyone else's, your brain defaults to assuming that you are also central in the minds of others. You become the reference point for interpreting motives, assigning blame, or measuring impact. The world feels more personal, more about you, than it really is. Egocentric bias shows up in small and large ways. At work, you may overestimate your responsibility for team outcomes, good or bad. In friendships, you assume your absence or presence matters more than it does. When a plan falls through, you worry that it reflects on your value, not just on logistics or timing. If a conversation grows awkward, you replay your own words, convinced they caused the discomfort. The feeling is subtle, but persistent. Everything comes back to you. This bias is reinforced by memory. When recalling group conversations or shared events, people routinely overestimate how much they contributed. In experiments, couples asked to estimate their share of household chores or family duties almost always add up to more than 100%. Each person remembers their own effort in detail and discounts what others did. This is not a deliberate deception. It is the mind's way of making sense of limited information. Egocentric bias also fuels misunderstandings. When you interpret someone's mood or silence as a reaction to something you said or did, you may act defensively or anxiously, making the situation worse. The other person may be preoccupied with their own concerns, unaware of your interpretation. Relationships become tangled in projections and assumptions, each person at the center of their own imagined universe, rarely seeing the other's reality clearly. Social situations are especially ripe for egocentric distortion. The fear of embarrassment or judgment is amplified by the belief that others are paying close attention to your mistakes, quirks, or appearance. In reality, most people are as preoccupied with their own worries as you are with yours. The spotlight effect, a close cousin of egocentric bias, makes every stumble or awkward moment feel monumental when, to everyone else, it is barely noticed or quickly forgotten. Egocentric bias can also affect your perception of conflict or praise. A passing criticism feels like a personal attack, even if it was not intended that way. A compliment is remembered long after it was given, while the giver has already moved on. The tendency to take things personally can lead to unnecessary hurt, pride, or defensiveness. The consequences of egocentric bias are not always negative. Sometimes, believing you matter more can increase your sense of agency, responsibility, or motivation. It can encourage you to take initiative or to be conscientious about your impact. But more often, it leads to anxiety, misunderstanding, and disappointment. You carry burdens that are not yours, miss opportunities to connect, or feel slighted by slights that never occurred. Awareness of egocentric bias is the first step toward freedom. When you catch yourself assuming that something is about you, pause and ask, what other explanations are possible? Is this reaction really about me? Or could it be about the other person's mood, history, or concerns? When you replay conversations, remember that others are likely doing the same, worrying about themselves, not about you. Practice seeing situations from multiple perspectives. Ask people directly how they feel, rather than guessing. When tension arises, imagine how the scene might look from another person's point of view. In group projects, acknowledge the limits of your own awareness and appreciate the invisible contributions of others. In relationships, resist the urge to personalize every mood, decision, or conflict. Not every silence is rejection. Not every disappointment is your fault. Give others the benefit of the doubt and offer the same kindness to yourself. When you feel hurt or left out, remember that most people are living at the center of their own concerns, just as you are. Egocentric bias can be softened by humility. Remind yourself that the world is vast and complex, and that you are only one part of it. Your actions matter, but not everything revolves around you. The same is true for everyone else. This humility brings relief. Your mistakes are not as devastating. Your triumphs not as world-changing. Your burdens not as heavy as they might seem. In the end, egocentric bias is a quiet distortion, born of the way consciousness works. It cannot be eliminated, but it can be recognized and managed. By learning to see beyond yourself, you become more connected, more understanding, and less burdened by the illusion that everything is personal. The freedom that comes is not from disappearing, but from realizing that you are one among many, each with a story, each with a center, and each capable of seeing the world just a little more clearly. The framing effect, how words quietly change what you think you see. Every day, the world presents you with choices. Buy or save. Take the risk or play it safe. Support the policy or oppose it. These decisions rarely feel as manipulated as they truly are. But beneath the surface, there is a quiet bias guiding your judgment, a bias not in the facts themselves, but in the way they are presented. This is the framing effect, the subtle, persistent influence of language and context on how you perceive and respond to information. The way something is described can shape your emotions, sway your decisions, and even determine your beliefs, all without your awareness. The framing effect begins with a simple truth about the human mind. Context matters more than you realize. Imagine a medical treatment with a 90% survival rate. It sounds reassuring, promising. Now imagine the same treatment described as having a 10% mortality rate. The numbers are identical, but the emotional impact is radically different. Most people are more likely to accept the treatment when the outcome is framed in terms of survival, even though the risk is the same. The words chosen, survival or mortality, quietly change what you think you see. This bias is not just about statistics. It pervades every aspect of decision-making. When buying a product, a sign that reads 95% fat-free feels more appealing than one that says contains 5% fat, even though they are identical. Politicians frame policies as tax relief rather than tax cuts, shaping public perception through word choice alone. In news, a protest is described as peaceful or disruptive, depending on the desired narrative. The frame is rarely neutral. It is designed to guide your mind toward a particular reaction. The framing effect is powerful because it works below the level of conscious reasoning. The mind does not simply absorb facts. It interprets them through the lens of context, emotion, and expectation. A loss feels worse than a missed gain, even if the monetary value is identical. A disease described as rare feels safer than one described by the number of annual cases. The same situation, presented with different language, evokes different decisions. Psychological research shows how malleable human judgment is to framing. In classic studies, Participants were asked to choose between medical treatments. One was framed as saving 200 out of 600 lives, the other as resulting in 400 deaths out of 600. Even though the outcomes were mathematically the same, most people chose differently depending on whether the frame emphasized lives saved or lives lost. The negative frame produced more risk-taking, while the positive frame encouraged caution. The difference was not in the facts, but in the words. Framing does not just influence what you choose. It shapes what you remember and believe. The mind is drawn to stories and images that match the frame. When an event is described as a tragedy, the focus shifts to loss and suffering. When it is described as a lesson, the mind searches for growth and meaning. Language directs attention, and attention directs memory. This effect can be used to manipulate, intentionally or not. Advertisers, politicians, and media organizations all understand the power of framing. They highlight positive features, downplay negatives, and choose words that resonate with their audience. The result is that your preferences, fears, and beliefs are shaped by invisible forces long before you make a conscious choice. Framing also interacts with your own values and beliefs. You are more likely to accept a frame that aligns with your worldview, and to reject those that challenge it. Over time, repeated exposure to certain frames solidifies attitudes and narrows perspective. The mind, seeking coherence, finds it easier to stay within a familiar narrative than to constantly reevaluate. The consequences of the framing effect are everywhere. In health, patients may reject treatments because the risks are framed in frightening ways, even when the odds are in their favor. In business, leaders make strategic errors because opportunities are framed as threats. In relationships, arguments escalate when words highlight blame rather than solutions. Even in your internal dialogue, the way you talk to yourself shapes how you feel about your past, your future, and your worth. Is it possible to escape the framing effect? Not entirely, but awareness can weaken its hold. When faced with a decision, pause and ask, how else could this be described? What is the opposite frame? And how does it change my perception? Deliberately seek out different perspectives and challenge your first emotional response. When reading news or listening to arguments, notice the language. What is being emphasized? What is being hidden? Practice reframing your own experiences. When setbacks occur, describe them in terms of learning rather than failure. When judging others, shift from blame to understanding. In conversations, use neutral or balanced language, and invite others to share their frames. The more flexible you're thinking, the less vulnerable you are to invisible manipulation. In organizations and leadership, encourage transparency about framing. When making proposals or presenting data, offer both the positive and negative frames. Foster an environment where language is examined, not just accepted. This honesty builds trust and supports better decisions. In the end, the framing effect is a reminder of how fragile and context-dependent human perception is. The world is not just what it is, but what it is called. The words you choose, internally and externally, shape the reality you live in. To live wisely is to notice the frame, question it, and seek the truth that lies beneath. Only then can you hope to see clearly, choose freely, and understand what you are truly looking at. Just World Hypothesis. Why you want to believe everyone deserves their fate. There is a hidden narrative in the way people interpret life's triumphs and tragedies, a silent bias that quietly tugs at your sense of fairness, comfort, and order. This is the Just World Hypothesis, the deeply rooted belief that the world is fundamentally fair, that people get what they deserve, and that deserving people ultimately get what is good. It is a story the mind wants to tell, a world governed by justice, where hard work leads to success, where suffering is punishment for mistakes, and where virtue is eventually rewarded. This belief does not just comfort, it shapes how you judge others, respond to misfortune, and even view your own future. The just world hypothesis begins in childhood, woven into the stories you hear and the lessons you are taught. Fairy tales end with justice served, villains defeated, and good people living happily ever after. Parents and teachers encourage the idea that effort brings reward and wrongdoing brings punishment. The message is not only moral, but practical. If you behave, you will be safe. If you work hard, you will succeed. The longing for a just world is both emotional and existential. It reduces fear, soothes anxiety, and makes life feel predictable. But as you move through the world, evidence to the contrary accumulates. Good people suffer. Injustice goes unpunished. Luck and circumstance shape destinies as much as character or effort. Yet, the mind is reluctant to let go of the story. The belief in a just world persists, often beneath awareness. It offers reassurance that life is not arbitrary, that chaos can be kept at bay, and that suffering has meaning. Without this belief, the world can feel dangerous, random, and overwhelming. The just world hypothesis influences perception in powerful ways. When you hear of someone's misfortune, the first impulse is often to search for a reason. What did they do to bring this on themselves? When a person succeeds, you may assume they worked harder, made better choices, or deserved the reward. This tendency can lead to blaming victims and excusing the powerful. The mind prefers an explanation, even an unjust one, to the discomfort of randomness. Research shows how quickly this bias appears. In experiments, people observing another's suffering often assume, consciously or not, that the victim must have done something to deserve their fate. This tendency is stronger when you feel powerless to help, or when the suffering is severe. It is easier to protect your own sense of safety and control by believing that misfortune is earned. Because if it were not, then it could just as easily happen to you. The just world hypothesis also shapes social policy, justice systems, and public opinion. Narratives about poverty, crime, or illness are colored by the desire to believe that people are responsible for their circumstances. This bias can justify inequality, reinforce prejudice, and diminish empathy. When success is explained as merit and suffering as failure, compassion is replaced by judgment. At a personal level, the just world hypothesis is a double-edged sword. When things go well, you feel secure in your choices, believing that you are reaping what you have sown. When misfortune strikes, however, the same bias can turn inward, leading to shame, guilt, or self-blame. You wonder what you did to deserve disappointment, loss, or pain. The world feels fair, but you become the villain in your own story. The persistence of this bias is not just a failure of logic. It is a defense against anxiety. To live with the knowledge that life is unpredictable, that tragedy can strike anyone, that virtue is not always rewarded, is unsettling. The belief in a just world restores order, even when it is a fiction. It makes suffering bearable and success sweeter. Yet, this bias comes at a cost. The refusal to see randomness or injustice leads to blindness, both to your own vulnerability and to the needs of others. It discourages collective action, fosters inequality, and breeds a quiet cruelty, a tendency to turn away from the suffering of others because it is easier to believe they brought it on themselves. Is it possible to overcome the just world hypothesis? Not entirely. The longing for fairness is part of being human, but awareness can soften its hold. When you catch yourself blaming victims, pause and ask what other factors could be at play: chance, circumstance, injustice, or simple bad luck. When judging your own misfortunes, remember that not everything is deserved. Life is often a mix of intention and accident. Practice empathy, not just for those who succeed, but especially for those who suffer. Resist the urge to explain away pain, and instead offer support, understanding, or solidarity. When you benefit from luck or privilege, acknowledge it. Gratitude grows from seeing the whole picture. not just the parts you controlled. In leadership, policy, and community, work to create structures that protect the vulnerable, correct injustice, and recognize the role of circumstance in every life. Celebrate achievement, but never at the expense of compassion. The world is not a perfect meritocracy, and pretending that it is serves no one. In the end, the just world hypothesis is a story the mind tells to make sense of chaos. It offers comfort, but it is not always true. To live wisely is to see the world as it is, to honor fairness where it exists, to fight for it where it doesn't, and to hold compassion above certainty. Fate does not always give people what they deserve, but you can choose to respond with understanding, humility, and care. In that choice, you bring a measure of justice to a world that is still learning what it means to be fair. Cognitive dissonance, the art of lying to yourself without knowing it. There is a peculiar kind of pain that arises when your mind cannot make its pieces fit together. It's a quiet, private discomfort, not the sharp agony of loss or the loud panic of fear, but a persistent background hum that will not go away. This is cognitive dissonance, one of the deepest and most universal mechanisms that shape how human beings think, feel, and act. It is the mind's way of protecting itself from contradiction, even when the cost is the truth. You may believe you are honest with yourself. You may feel certain that your convictions are anchored in fact and that your actions are consistent with your values. But cognitive dissonance is not about dishonesty in the ordinary sense. It is not a conscious lie, but an unconscious rewriting of reality, an automatic process in which your mind quietly distorts, edits, or buries information that threatens your sense of self, your beliefs, or your narrative about the world. It starts with conflict. Maybe you think of yourself as a kind person, but you act selfishly in a moment of stress. Maybe you believe the world is fair, but witness evidence of injustice. Maybe you hold two beliefs that cannot both be true, but you cannot let go of either one. The mind is not built to tolerate these gaps for long. The resulting tension, the sense that something is off, is cognitive dissonance. The discomfort is subtle but persistent, an itch beneath the surface of awareness. Most people will do almost anything to make it go away. Cognitive dissonance doesn't ask you to change your behavior or your beliefs in the light of new evidence. Instead, it pushes you to adjust your perception of reality, often without your knowledge. The process is elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its power. You reinterpret events, downplay evidence, invent explanations, or focus only on what confirms your chosen story. Sometimes, the mind even erases uncomfortable facts from memory, creating gaps that are quietly filled in with what must have happened. This is why people can hold on to beliefs long after they have been disproved. It is why smokers rationalize their habit by minimizing health risks, why investors refuse to sell failing stocks, why partners stay in unhealthy relationships. It is why you defend a decision, not because it was wise, but because it was yours. The mind abhors contradiction, and it will bend reality to restore coherence, even at the expense of honesty. Consider the classic example, the fox and the grapes. The fox cannot reach the grapes, so he convinces himself they were probably sour anyway. He avoids the pain of failure by adjusting his belief about what he wanted in the first place. Humans do the same, but with far greater complexity and subtlety. When you are denied a job, you may decide you didn't really want it. When a relationship ends, you may come to believe your former partner was never right for you. These are not lies told with malice. They are stories constructed to ease the ache of contradiction. In groups, cognitive dissonance becomes even more powerful. When you identify with a political party, religion, or social group, any evidence that threatens the group's integrity feels like a threat to your own identity. The discomfort is shared and amplified, and the urge to rationalize becomes collective. Groups invent narratives to justify their actions, rewrite history to suit their needs. and reject evidence that could fracture the sense of unity. The mind's private need for coherence becomes a public ritual, repeated until the contradiction fades into the background. The real danger of cognitive dissonance is that it hides itself. Unlike simple bias, which can sometimes be spotted and corrected, dissonance works at a deeper level. It shapes the stories you tell yourself about who you are and why you act as you do. It influences not only your beliefs, but your very sense of reality. You may come to believe you have always felt a certain way, always known a certain truth, because your mind has quietly rewritten the past to fit the present. The lie becomes indistinguishable from memory. Psychological experiments have demonstrated this mechanism in action. In the famous study by Leon Festinger, participants performed a boring task and were asked to lie to another person about how enjoyable it was. Those paid only a small amount to lie later convinced themselves the task wasn't so bad, while those paid more admitted the lie. The brain, unable to tolerate the gap between action and belief, resolves it by changing belief. This effect is not limited to trivial situations. It colors major life decisions, justifies moral failings, and cements ideologies that should have died long ago. Cognitive dissonance is also a force behind stubbornness. When you invest in an idea, emotionally, financially, or socially, the cost of admitting error becomes unbearable. The more public your commitment, the harder it is to turn back. Instead, the mind digs deeper, finding ever more creative ways to explain away the evidence, to hold on to belief in the face of contradiction. This is why change, especially at the level of identity, is so rare and so difficult. To change a core belief is to rip out a thread that holds the self together. You can see cognitive dissonance at work in everyday life. A parent who believes in nonviolence but shouts in anger at a child later convinces herself it was necessary for discipline. A leader who preaches integrity but cuts corners justifies it as pragmatism. A person who prides himself on rationality ignores inconvenient data or cherry-picks facts to suit a conclusion. In each case, the dissonance is smoothed over, not by honest reflection, but by subtle shifts in perception, memory, or logic. Social systems often depend on cognitive dissonance to function. Institutions may require people to act against their conscience, but then provide stories, rules, or rituals to ease the discomfort. Soldiers in war zones, workers in unethical industries, members of organizations with conflicting missions, each must find ways to reconcile what they do with what they believe. The easiest path is to change the belief, to adjust the moral story until the tension becomes invisible. This is not a sign of personal weakness, but a universal feature of the human mind. Is there any way to escape this art of self-deception? Awareness helps, but it is not enough. Even when you know about cognitive dissonance, your mind will resist accepting contradiction. The discomfort will push you toward resolution, often before you realize what is happening. The only true antidote is radical honesty, a willingness to feel the pain of inconsistency, to admit error, to live with the awkwardness of not knowing. This requires courage and humility, two qualities the mind is quick to avoid when coherence is threatened. Practicing this honesty is difficult. It means pausing when you feel defensive, when you rush to explain away a mistake, when you cling to a belief that no longer fits the facts. It means seeking out people and ideas that challenge you, not because you enjoy conflict, but because you know the risk of living in a world tailored to your comfort. It means accepting that sometimes the truth will hurt more than the lie, but that the pain is temporary, while the freedom that comes from clarity is lasting. Cognitive dissonance cannot be eliminated. It is part of the architecture of consciousness, but you can learn to recognize its signals, the tension, the defensiveness, the quick rationalization. You can slow down your thinking, question your reactions, and ask yourself whether you are seeking the truth or seeking comfort. In the long run, the willingness to live with dissonance To hold contradictory truths side by side is a mark of psychological maturity. In a world of noise and pressure, the mind's greatest temptation is to lie to itself and call it truth. The art of cognitive dissonance is not a flaw, but a feature, a way to keep moving forward when the world does not make sense. But if you want to see clearly, if you want to live honestly, you must be willing to feel the discomfort, to recognize the artifice, and to tell yourself the truth, even when every part of your mind wants to turn away. The mind's most subtle deception is not what it tells others, but what it tells itself. In that private conversation, in the stories you create to ease your own pain, the art of lying is perfected. Only when you question that art, when you allow contradiction to linger, do you open the door to real understanding of yourself, of others, and of the world as it truly is.